Hi everyone. If you enjoyed this video, please subscribe. If you haven't subscribed yet, I'd love to see you join me. And don't forget to like and let me know what you think in the comments. My name is Ben Miller, I'm 29, and what I'm about to tell you happened last fall in a backwater place called Ravens Hollow, Illinois. Honestly, I still can't sleep right. I wake up sometimes, gasping for air, convinced I hear things whispering in the dark. I don't know if anyone will believe me, but I gotta get this out. Maybe it'll help me believe it was real, and maybe it'll warn someone else off the same path. It all started with my best friend, Jake Collins. Jake's one of those guys who lives for a thrill, always chasing the next adrenaline rush or some crazy ghost story. Me, I'm more of a homebody. Don't get me wrong, I like a good scare as much as the next guy, but I prefer it on a movie screen or around a campfire, you know. But when Jake told me he wanted to camp out at Cutter's Ridge, a place that was supposedly a hideout for river pieback, when I said yes. I didn't want him going alone, especially with the stories I'd heard about people vanishing in those woods. So, we drove down from Chicago in Jake's beat-up Jeep. The plan was to spend a weekend hiking, filming some stuff for his YouTube channel, so which, let's be honest, nobody watched, and exploring this infamous cave. I knew the place had a shady past, outlaws, and all that, and there were more than a few rumors about weird stuff happening there. Jake was hoping to catch proof of something, anything to get more subscribers. I just wanted to make sure he didn't break his neck. We got there around noon on a Friday. The late autumn sun was already getting low, casting long shadows across the empty parking lot near the visitor center. The whole place was deserted except for a dinky gas station at the edge of the road. We figured we'd fill up the tank before heading deeper into the wilderness. The gas station attendant was this old guy, all grizzled with a permanent squint. He didn't say much until Jake mentioned we were camping near the cave. Then, the guy just stopped pumping, shook his head, and said, "Don't do it. People go missing out there every year. You want a decent campsite, stick to the marked trails. Leave the cave and the ridge to the ghosts." Jake, of course, just grinned. You tell him not to do something, and that's the first thing he's gonna do. Me though, I felt a knot tighten in my stomach. A little voice in my head was telling me to turn around, go back to Chicago, and forget the whole thing. But I told myself I was being ridiculous. Small towns always have these crazy stories, right? We thanked the old guy and followed this winding, tree-lined road to the campsite we'd picked. The place was even emptier than I expected for a Friday. Only 2 other cars in the lot, and I didn't see a single hiker. Jake just shrugged it off, said it meant fewer people to scare away the good footage. Or we set up our tent, which turned out to be this flimsy thing Jake had grabbed last minute. The zipper was busted, and there was a tier near the entrance that let in a constant draft. Our flashlights were practically dead, too, because Jake forgot extra batteries. It was a recipe for a miserable weekend, but Jake just laughed it off. Part of the adventure, he said. He always said that. Night came on fast. The day's warmth was gone, replaced by this deep chill that sank right into your bones. We sat by a little fire, listening to the rustling of animals in the woods. After a while, I started hearing this faint murmuring, like people whispering just out of earshot. I looked over at Jake, expecting him to say something, but he was just staring into the flames, totally oblivious. I figured it was just the wind blowing through the cave entrance. It had to be after midnight when I saw him for the first time. This guy, just sitting on a rock about 30 feet away, watching us. He was wearing this perfectly tailored suit, the kind you see on businessmen downtown. Dark hair, sharp features, and eyes that seemed to reflect the firelight way more than normal eyes should. Jake was the first to speak. "Hey man, didn't expect company this far out." The stranger stood up, walked closer, and gave this little nod. "Good evening, gentlemen," he said. His voice was smooth, like expensive whiskey. "Lovely night for a campfire." There was something about him that just rubbed me the wrong way. Maybe it was his clothes, or the way he'd just appeared out of nowhere without making a sound. I forced a smile. "We didn't hear you come up, you camping around here." He smiled back, but it didn't quite reach his eyes. "Just passing through. My name is Silas." "Silas," Jake repeated, like he was trying the name out. "Cool. I'm Jake and this is Ben." Silas didn't offer a handshake, just another one of those little bows. I don't know why, but my stomach was churning. The night felt even colder now. Jake offered him a seat by the fire, but Silas declined. Instead, he said the strangest thing. "I have an offer for you both," he said. "Something that might interest you, if you're open to new opportunities." I glanced at Jake, expecting him to be weirded out too. But Jake, he was leaning forward, hooked. "What kind of offer?" he asked. Silas's eyes flicked to me, then back to Jake. "Let's just say I know what you each desire. What keeps you awake at night? What drives you?" His tone sent a shiver down my spine. There was no way this guy could know anything about us. But he kept talking, like he'd been reading our minds. He mentioned Jake's frustration with his YouTube channel, how he felt like nobody was paying attention. Then he talked about my mom, who was sick back home, and how I was worried sick about her medical bills. I stood up, suddenly feeling very exposed. "How do you know that?" He just shrugged. "I'm a good observer of people, Ben." His gaze shifted to Jake. "And I can help you, Jake, become more than just another content creator, in exchange for a small favor." Jake's eyes were shining with that crazy glint I only saw when he was onto some new conspiracy theory. "What favor?" he asked. Silas smiled, a slow, deliberate curl of his lips. "We can discuss that when you're ready," Silas repeated, that creepy smile still plastered on his face. Panic started clawing its way up my throat. "I think you should leave," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. It came out more like a croak. But Jake, damn him, was completely enthralled. Silas reached into his jacket and pulled out this small, round thing. It looked like an antique coin, but I couldn't make out any details in the firelight. "Take this," he said, holding it out to Jake. "Keep it safe. If you change your mind, focus on it, and I'll return." I couldn't believe it. To my horror, Jake took the coin without hesitation. Silas gave another one of those little nods, and then just walked away, back into the darkness. It was like he vanished. 1 second he was there, and the next, he was gone. I stood there frozen, hugging myself against the cold, the fire crackling mockingly in the silence. Jake didn't say anything for a long time, just stared at the coin in his hand. Finally, I found my voice. "What the hell was that, Jake? You need to throw that thing away." He looked up at me, his eyes wide. "He was probably just messing with us," he said. But he didn't sound convinced. He slid the coin into his jacket pocket. "Messing with us? He knew about Mom's medical bills. He knew about your channel. How could he possibly know that stuff?" I was practically yelling now. "I don't know, Ben. Maybe he overheard us talking earlier. Maybe he's just a really good guesser." But I knew he didn't believe it either. I tried to argue, but it was no use. Once Jake gets an idea in his head, there's no changing his mind. He's stubborn as a mule. The rest of the night was a blur. I couldn't sleep, every little sound outside the tent making me jump. I kept expecting Silas to reappear, to come back and finish whatever he'd started. The next morning, I woke up feeling sore and cold. That flimsy tent hadn't done much to keep out the damp. Jake was already outside, rummaging through the jeep for his camera gear. "I want to explore the cave," he announced when I crawled out, stiff and groggy. "Maybe we should just pack up," I countered. "We could still salvage the weekend, find a different campsite." He waved me off. "Don't chicken out now, Ben. We came to see the cave, so that's what we're doing." Reluctantly, I followed him towards the cave entrance. It was huge, carved into the limestone cliffs above the river. It was even colder inside, and the air smelled damp and earthy, with something else underneath, something metallic. Just a few steps in, we found it to a half-collapsed tent, ripped open along the side. There were dark stains on the fabric. I knelt down, touching one of the patches. It flaked under my fingers. "This is blood," I whispered, my heart pounding in my chest. Even Jake looked pale. He tried to film it, his hands shaking a little. There was no sign of whoever owned the tent. The only clue was a single shoe, lying nearby, covered in dried mud. We pressed on, our weak flashlights barely cutting through the darkness. Every so often, I thought I saw a shadow move in the corner of my eye, but when I turned, there was nothing there. Jake kept going deeper, looking for more evidence of foul play, or proof of the supernatural. I guess my nerves were completely frayed. I kept pleading with him to turn back. Eventually, he agreed. We headed back to our campsite, and the whole time, I felt like we were being watched. Like something was following us, just out of sight. That night, I insisted we keep watch in shifts. Jake laughed, but he agreed. "Fine," he said. "I'll take the first half of the night." I crawled into the tent, exhausted, but sleep wouldn't come. Every rustle, every snap of a twig outside, made me jolt awake. When I finally did drift off, I had these messed up dreams of being dragged through the cave by men in old, timey pirate clothes. They kept whispering my name in these gravelly voices. I woke up hours later to silence. The fire was out, and Jake was gone. Panic slammed into me. I scrambled out of the tent, yelling his name. My flashlight flickered, illuminating the empty folding chair where Jake had been sitting. No footprints, no sign of him, except for his camera, lying on the ground. Then I felt it, a presence behind me. I spun around, flashlight beam shaking in my hand, and there he was. Jake. He was standing there, looking completely out of it, a wild look in his eyes. "Where the hell were you?" I demanded, my voice trembling with relief and anger. He didn't answer, just staggered closer, pressing something into my hand. It was the coin. It felt strangely warm, almost pulsing. "I can't do it," he said, his voice hoarse. I told him I'd give him what he wanted, but I can't. The blood drained from my face. "What did you agree to, Jake?" His eyes locked with mine, and I saw tears welling up in them. He told me if I gave him what he wanted, I'd become famous. All the success and recognition I ever dreamed of. At first I thought it was just some crazy joke, but I heard voices. Ben, they kept pushing me, telling me to do things. "What things?" I asked, my stomach clenching. He swallowed hard. "He wants a sacrifice." My stomach lurched. "You mean another person?" Jake nodded, tears slipping down his cheeks. "I can't do it, man. But I feel like I'm losing control." I tried to throw the coin away, but it just reappeared in my pocket. We stood there, trembling in the darkness, the first hint of dawn starting to creep over the horizon. I wanted to pack up and leave, right then and there. But Jake shook his head. "He won't let me," Jake whispered, and the despair in his voice was like a punch to the gut. I knew, deep down, that he was right. This wasn't something we could just run away from. A few hours later, as the weak morning light filtered through the trees, we made a decision, a desperate, probably insane decision. We were going back into the cave. We figured if we could find Silas, confront him, maybe we could break whatever hold he had on Jake. It was a long shot, but we couldn't think of anything else. We told ourselves that if we could just talk to him, maybe we could put a stop to it. The air inside the cave felt heavier than before, if that was even possible. We found more signs of people who'd been there before us, discarded backpacks, broken flashlights, tattered clothes. And those dark stains, they seemed to shimmer on the rock floor in the dim light. My flashlight was flickering, threatening to die completely. Jake's grip on the coin tightened, and I could see how it pulsed faintly with each breath he took. As we went deeper, our footsteps echoed off the limestone walls. Then, I saw it again, a shape darting across the edge of my light, then another one. Too quick to make out clearly. "We're not alone in here," I hissed to Jake. He barely acknowledged me, his eyes fixed straight ahead, like he was in a trance. Suddenly, a figure emerged from the darkness, Silas. He was still wearing that pristine suit, looking completely untouched by the grime of the cave. Behind him, shapes slithered and shifted, like the walls themselves were alive with shadows. "You've come back," Silas said, his voice echoing in the vast chamber. "I take it you're ready to finalize our arrangement." Jake sank to his knees, shaking his head. I can't do it," he stammered. Silas's calm facade didn't crack. "Then the price has changed." But before I could react, something slammed into me from behind, sending me sprawling onto the rocky ground. Pain exploded in my head, and darkness swam at the edges of my vision. By the time I regained some semblance of clarity, I realized my hands and feet were tied. Someone or something had bound me to a jagged outcropping of rock, like some kind of altar. Panic flooded my veins. I thrashed against the ropes, yelling Jake's name. From my position, I could just make out the glimmer of Silas's suit. He was standing over Jake, who was lying on his side trembling. Silas's voice echoed through the cave, clear and cold. "If you won't bring me a sacrifice, perhaps I should take you instead." Jake begged for mercy, tears streaming down his face. The shadows around Silas flickered, forming into the shapes of hunched figures with hollow eyes. They descended on Jake, dragging him deeper into a side tunnel, his screams echoing off the cave walls. I thrashed against my bindings until the rope bit into my skin, drawing blood. I could hear Jake's screams growing fainter, replaced by the chanting of those shadowy things. It was a language I didn't understand, something guttural and ancient. My heart was pounding so hard, thought it was going to burst out of my chest. Then, silence. Complete and utter silence. Terror consumed me. Had they killed Jake? Were they going to come back for me next? Desperation fueled me. I twisted and turned, rubbing the ropes against a sharp edge of the rock. The fibers started to fray. After what felt like an eternity, I managed to break free. I stumbled to my feet. My flashlight was gone, but I found a small headlamp lying nearby. Its light was weak, flickering, but it was better than nothing. I stumbled into the passage where they dragged Jake, the chanting still echoing in my ears. The tunnel opened into a large cavern, lit by an eerie, phosphorescent glow coming from mineral deposits in the walls. The shadowy figures were gone. Only Jake's camera lay on the ground, along with more of those dark, sickening stains. My throat constricted. There was no sign of Jake, just the overwhelming smell of decay. In the corner of the cavern, I spotted a smaller tunnel leading upwards, possibly an exit. I took a step towards it and then I froze. Silas emerged from behind a rock formation, his face as smooth and calm as ever. "You could still make a deal," he said, in a tone that suggested we were just chatting at a coffee shop. "I know your mother is ill. I can heal her. Give you all the money you'll ever need. You can save your friend. All it takes is your word." I wanted to scream at him, to demand he bring Jake back. But fear had me by the throat. My heart hammered in my chest, and for a moment, just a fleeting moment, I actually considered it. If there was a chance to help my mom, to save Jake. Maybe it was worth it, but the memory of Jake's screams, of the missing campers, of that blood-stained tent, snapped me out of it. This wasn't some miracle worker. This was a monster. I choose to walk away, I said, my voice steadier than I expected. It felt important somehow to say it out loud, to defy him. Silas tilted his head like a curious bird. You'd choose your mother's suffering over an agreement that could end all her pain. His words dripped with a chilling sort of pity, but I caught a flicker of something else in his eyes. Anger, maybe. My hands clenched into fists. I choose to walk away rather than be your puppet. He smirked. Then so be it. And just like that, he vanished. One moment he was there, the next gone, leaving only the echo of his voice bouncing off the cave walls. The next sound I heard was a low rumbling, like rocks grinding against each other. The cavern began to tremble. Dust and debris rained down from the ceiling. Instinct took over. I scrambled towards the narrow tunnel on the other side, the one leading upwards. The climb out was a blur of chaos. Rocks fell around me, some striking my shoulders and back. More than once I stumbled and nearly lost my footing, but adrenaline kept me going. My headlamp flickered in and out, making every step a gamble. Behind me, I could still hear that low chanting, or maybe it was just the pounding of my own heart in my ears. I didn't dare look back. Eventually I emerged under a patch of grey sky. Dawn was approaching, the light still weak but enough to see by. The mouth of the cave was a short distance away. I half crawled, half ran out of there, collapsing at the tree line. My entire body was shaking, a mixture of pain, terror, and exhaustion. I don't know how long I lay there, but eventually I forced myself to my feet and stumbled back towards the parking lot. When I arrived, I found Jake's Jeep still there, the keys in the ignition. Jake was nowhere to be seen. I drove to that same dingy gas station and tried to explain what happened to the old clerk and later to the authorities. They all looked at me like I was crazy or high, or maybe both. A search party went out, but they found no sign of Jake. All they discovered was our torn up tent and Jake's camera. The memory card was corrupted, unreadable. Officially, they wrote it off as an accident. Maybe Jake fell into a fissure in the cave, or drowned in the river. I was questioned for hours, but they had no evidence of a crime. At least, none they were willing to believe. I left Ravens Hollow in a daze, driving Jake's Jeep back home with tears streaming down my face. I told his family everything, but they looked at me with the same mixture of pity and disbelief I'd seen in the eyes of the police. How could I prove that the devil himself, or whatever Silas was, had tricked Jake into some terrible bargain? It's been months since that night, and the nightmares still come. My mom's illness hasn't improved, and I'm drowning in medical bills. Every so often, I think about Silas's offer, and a chill runs through me. I catch myself wondering, just for a second, if I should have agreed. But then I remember Jake's screams, the look of absolute terror on his face, and I know I made the only choice I could. Right before I left that godforsaken place, I realized something horrifying. That ornate coin, it was in my pocket. I had no memory of picking it up. I threw it into the river immediately, watched it sink beneath the surface. But I still feel its weight sometimes, like a phantom bruise. Every so often, I have a dream where I'm back in the cave, and Silas is standing there, holding out his hand. In the dream, he says, "Thee always come back, Ben." And the terrifying part is, I'm starting to believe he might be right. I pray I'm strong enough not to. I pray I never see that place or him, ever again. But a part of me, a dark, scared part, knows that the Hollow has a way of calling you back. And I don't know if I'll be able to resist forever. My name is Sarah Jenkins. I'm 28, a freelance journalist from Chicago, and what I'm about to tell you happened just a few months ago. It was during a road trip through rural Indiana, a trip I wish to God I'd never agreed to. My boyfriend, Mark Collins, is 30. He's a mechanical engineer and the adventurous type. You know, the kind of guy who'll take a wrong turn on purpose just to see where it leads. He'd planned this whole getaway thing as a way for us to reconnect. Things had been, well, tense between us. My freelance gigs had me stressed out and moody, and his job was sucking up all his time. We both felt like we needed a break. We just never figured that break would involve driving through the back roads near Goose Pond Fish and Wildlife Area at dusk with a car engine that sounded like it was about to give up the ghost. The trouble started when our GPS went haywire. 1 minute it was guiding us to a main road, the next, poof, the signal vanished. And we were wending down this narrow dirt lane, nothing but miles of wetlands and forest on either side. To make matters worse, the car started overheating. By the time we found a place to pull over, the sky was this deep, dark navy, and not a single streetlight broke through the darkness. Mark popped the hood, fiddling with the engine, while I waved my phone around, hoping for a signal. Nothing. He mumbled something about the radiator, then admitted he wasn't sure we'd make it to the nearest gas station, wherever that even was. That's when I saw it, a faint light in the distance, flickering through the trees. It looked like a porch light. I pointed it out to Mark, and after some back and forth, we decided to walk up this barely their dirt path that led to a rundown farmhouse. The place looked ancient, like something out of a horror movie. The wood siding was grey and splintered, and the roof sagged like it was ready to cave in. Still, a light in the window meant someone was home. We knocked on the door, not even sure if it would open. To our relief and, as I'd learn later, to our misfortune, it swung inward almost immediately. A petite, elderly woman with neatly pinned silver hair stood there, smiling like she'd been expecting us. She said her name was Mrs. Henderson. The moment she saw us, her expression turned all sympathetic. "Oh dear, you two must be exhausted," she said, her voice soft and pleasant. Come inside, come inside." She led us through this narrow hallway with faded floral wallpaper. The whole place smelled of old furniture, mildew, and something metallic that I couldn't quite place. But, despite the smell, the house had this weird, cozy warmth. An old lamp in the corner cast a soft glow, lighting up worn-out rugs and antique furniture. "Mrs. Henderson insisted we sit on this faded love seat while she bustled around in the kitchen, making tea. Mark and I exchanged a glance. I could see in his eyes that he was relieved. He'd always been one to believe in the kindness of strangers. Me, I was more cautious, more aware that rural Indiana could be just as sketchy as any big city if you trusted the wrong person. When Mrs. Henderson came back, she was carrying a tray with 2 steaming cups. "Drink up, it's my special brew," she said, offering us each a delicate teacup. The second I lifted that cup to my nose, I knew something was off. It smelled bitter, acrid. But Mark, he took a sip before I could even say anything. I forced a smile and pretended to drink, letting the liquid touch my lips without swallowing. The aftertaste that lingered on my tongue was rancid, metallic. My gut was screaming at me not to drink another drop. I kept the cup near my mouth, faking it, while Mrs. Henderson watched us with this unnerving intensity. "That's interesting," Mark said, coughing a little. "Thank you." She just nodded, her smile never fading. "I have a spare room you two can use tonight. It's not fancy, but it's comfortable." She led us up these creaky stairs to a bedroom at the end of a short hall. The walls up here were in even worse shape, peeling wallpaper, water stains, and this dampness that just hung in the air. But at least there was a bed. We thanked her profusely, and she left us with a parting smile that lingered just a second too long. The moment the door closed, Mark let out a quiet chuckle. "Well, this is definitely off the beaten path," he said. He didn't seem worried, just tired. Me, on the other hand, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was seriously wrong. "Mark," I whispered, "did you notice how she was watching us? Like she was waiting to see if we'd..." My voice trailed off as Mark sank onto the bed, his eyes fluttering. He looked pale. "I'm just tired," he mumbled. "Maybe you should lie down," I said, but as soon as he tried to stand, he wobbled, almost falling over. Alarmed, I helped him onto the mattress. "What's wrong?" He stared at me, eyelids heavy. "I feel dizzy," he murmured. My stomach's churning. Panic started to well up inside me. I grabbed my phone, and of course, no signal. I looked around the room for a landline, but there was none. Outside the window, the darkness was absolute, pressing against the glass. A sudden scratching sound made me jerk my head toward the door. It was like something, or someone, was running their nails along the wood. My heart hammered. I glanced back at Mark. His breathing was shallow, and his forehead was beaded with sweat. "I'll be right back," I whispered. "I need to find help." Before leaving, I propped the pillows under his head, trying to make him comfortable. As I opened the bedroom door, the hallway was pitch black. Mrs. Henderson must have turned off the lamp downstairs. Using the flashlight on my phone, I crept down the stairs, my senses on high alert. "Mrs. Henderson," I called out, "are you here?" No answer. The living room was empty, the old lamp switched off. The whole house felt suffocatingly still, like it was holding its breath. A door in the kitchen caught my eye. It was slightly ajar, revealing a rickety set of steps leading down into a cellar. A musty smell wafted up, mixing with that underlying metallic scent that I still couldn't identify. Curiosity, or maybe it was desperation, won over caution. If she was down there, maybe getting more supplies or something, I had to talk to her. I needed help for Mark, or at least a phone. Stepping carefully, I descended into the darkness, using my phone's flashlight to avoid tripping on the worn steps. The cellar smelled of damp earth and rotting wood, but there it was again, that other scent, stronger now, decayed, metallic. My heart was pounding in my ears. At the base of the steps, my light fell on something that made my blood run cold. A large table, stained dark with what looked like old, dried blood. Chains and shackles lay in a corner, along with bits of rope and twisted metal hooks. I swallowed hard, inching forward until my foot bumped something on the floor. When I aimed my phone downward, I nearly screamed. A human skull stared back at me, jaw slack, its eye sockets fixed eternally on nothing. I backed away, trying not to trip, my mind racing. I needed to get out of this cellar, get Mark, and run. But just as I turned, I heard a voice, faint and ragged, coming from behind a wooden door in the corner of the cellar. "Help," it croaked. "Please." I couldn't just abandon whoever was in there. Steeling myself, I approached the door. A padlock secured it, but the wood around it was old and rotting. Summoning more courage than I felt, I rammed my shoulder against the door. It took several tries, each jolt sending pain through my arm, but finally, the wood splintered, and the door gave way. The smell that hit me was worse than anything I'd encountered so far. A heady mixture of sweat, urine, and decay. Inside, I found two people bound to the wall. An older man with sunken eyes, who seemed barely conscious, and a younger, frantic-looking guy in tattered clothes. Both looked utterly terrified. "Oh God," I whispered, rushing to untie them. The older man was too weak to help. He just stared blankly, lips parted, breathing shallow. The younger man's eyes flicked toward me, hopeful but desperate. "My name's Peter," he said in a trembling voice. "She's locked us up. She's not human." "What do you mean?" "Not human?" I asked, though the evidence in this hellhole was definitely pointing towards something monstrous. Peter shook his head. I've been here for days, maybe weeks. I don't even know anymore. She lures people in. She'll poison them, paralyze them, and then she drains I don't know their life. She's not some sweet old woman. She's a witch, a demon, something. Every fiber of my being was screaming at me to get out of there. But Mark was still upstairs, defenseless. I'll help you, but I need to get my boyfriend out too. He drank her tea. Peter winced. Then you don't have much time. She'll come for him soon. Working in the narrow space, I struggled with the ropes around the older man, but they were tied tight. I need something sharp, I muttered, searching the floor. My flashlight beam landed on shards of broken glass near the door. I snatched one and started sawing through the rope. Suddenly, footsteps clacked on the cellar stairs. My stomach dropped. I killed the flashlight just in time to see Mrs. Henderson's silhouette at the bottom of the steps. She was humming quietly, her voice echoing in the cramped darkness. I held my breath, paralyzed by terror. Peter cowered behind me, and the older man made no sound at all. Her humming stopped. "Dear," she called sweetly. "Sarah, are you down here?" I could barely see her face, but I sensed her searching gaze. She took a step deeper into the cellar, and the faint outline of her figure seemed elongated. My eyes must have been playing tricks on me, but I swore her limbs looked too thin, too long. She paused, sniffing the air, then her head snapped in our direction. Before she could speak, the older man let out a wheeze, a feeble cry of pain. Mrs. Henderson lunged forward with inhuman speed. I saw a flash of her face, twisted in a grotesque grin, eyes wide and almost glowing in the dimness. Her teeth seemed sharp, needle-like. She grabbed the older man by the throat and, with a sickening jerk, slammed his head against the wall. His body went limp, and she dragged him out of the little room as if he weighed no more than a doll. Peter gagged, pressing his hand to his mouth. I wanted to scream, but terror kept me silent. We waited, huddled there in the darkness, listening to Mrs. Henderson's steps recede. The older man was gone, presumably taken for whatever horrific ritual she performed on the others. My only thought was getting Mark and escaping. I used the shard of glass to finish cutting Peter loose. "Stay quiet," I hissed. He nodded, and we crept toward the steps. The house above seemed silent again, as though that violent act in the cellar had never happened. Upstairs, the kitchen was empty. A single candle burned on the countertop, casting long, flickering shadows that danced across the walls. My heart pounded as I led Peter to the living room, then down the hall to the stairs leading to the second floor. Every floorboard creaked beneath our feet, and each noise made me flinch, expecting Mrs. Henderson to appear at any moment with that eerily cheerful smile. When we reached the bedroom door, I found it ajar. The bed was empty. Mark was gone. Fear and fury twisted in my gut. Had she taken him already? I turned, ready to confront Mrs. Henderson, when a moan drifted from somewhere down the hallway. I dashed toward the sound, Peter on my heels. At the far end of the corridor, there was another door, slightly open. Inside was a cramped storage room, and Mark lay on the floor, half conscious. The instant I dropped to my knees beside him, he weakly grabbed my arm. She tried to drag me out," he whispered, his voice trembling. I fought back, but I can't move. His body was cold, soaked in sweat. I looked around for anything that might help, anything at all. That's when I spotted the large window at the back of the room. Outside, the night stretched on, but I could see our car in the distance, illuminated dimly by moonlight. If we could get out, maybe we'd stand a chance. We could hide in the trees, or try to fix the car enough to get away. Anything was better than staying here. "We'll carry him," I whispered to Peter. We have to find a way out, maybe the back door or a window on the first floor. Peter nodded, and we each took one of Mark's arms, lifting him up. He was weak but still conscious enough to mumble encouragement. We made it down the stairs without encountering Mrs. Henderson, though each step felt like an eternity. In the living room, I paused to listen. Nothing. Maybe she was still in the cellar, occupied with whatever she did to that poor old man. The front door was locked tight, and the latch seemed ancient, rusted shut. We tried the windows, nailed closed. Our next hope was a side door near the kitchen. As we crept toward it, I glanced out the window above the sink. My breath caught in my throat. Mrs. Henderson was striding across the yard toward a small shed. Even in the darkness, her silhouette looked wrong. Limbs too spindly, head cocked at an unnatural angle. She carried something over her shoulder, something limp. Peter stifled a sob. "She's going to notice we're gone," he whispered. Prying open the side door, we slipped outside into the cool night air. The porch groaned under our combined weight as we lowered Mark down the steps. We started across the yard, keeping low. Ahead, the neglected barn-like shed stood out against the moonlit sky, a sagging structure that looked as though it might collapse at any moment. We crept behind it, hoping to circle around to our car, but before we made it past the corner of the shed, we heard a raspy hiss. I whirled around, expecting to see Mrs. Henderson. Instead, standing just behind us was the figure of a man. His face was gaunt, eyes sunken. Someone else trapped on this property. But no, the way he regarded us felt off. I recognized the tattered shirt from the cellar. It was the older man, the one Mrs. Henderson had dragged away, except he was impossibly on his feet again. His eyes were unfocused, mouth slack. When he took a step forward, I saw fresh blood staining his neck and the front of his shirt. He lurched, swiping blindly, moaning in a low, haunting pitch. It was as if something else moved his body. Horror churned in my stomach. Was he possessed, or a puppet controlled by Mrs. Henderson? Peter let out a terrified squeak and took off running, leaving me alone to hold Mark up. The older man advanced slowly, but I could feel something sinister radiating from him. Every survival instinct I had screamed to run, to get Mark and go, but that wasn't easy with him in this state. "Emma," Mark rasped. "Go, just run." No, I refused, gritting my teeth. I half dragged, half carried him around the far side of the shed. The older man shuffled after us, arms reaching out. We had a few yards on him, but it wasn't much of a head start. Then Peter appeared in front of us, wide-eyed and frantic. "Come on," he hissed, waving us toward an opening at the back of the shed. We ducked inside, closing the door behind us. The inside of the shed was dark and cluttered, tools and piles of junk strewn everywhere. The smell was horrific, rotting flesh, rancid chemicals. By the moonlight filtering through the warped planks, I saw it heaps of personal belongings. Cell phones, wallets, purses. I even recognized some car keys. My stomach clenched. This was where Mrs. Henderson stashed the remains of her victims' lives, the evidence of all those who had never left. Among the piles, I glimpsed scattered bones and dried blood. I tried not to vomit. Suddenly, the door flew open. Mrs. Henderson stood there, her body silhouetted in pale moonlight, and for the first time, I saw her true form clearly. Her arms had elongated, and her face was sunken, the skin stretched too tightly over her skull. Her eyes glowed faintly, and her mouth split into a monstrous grin, revealing needle-like teeth glinting wet in the faint light. Peter screamed, stumbling backward. In that moment, I saw something flicker across his expression. Guilt, maybe, or fear. He turned to Mrs. Henderson and said, breathlessly, "I brought them, just like you asked. You promised." She lunged forward with startling speed, grabbing him by the collar. "You brought them," she repeated, in a voice that was half hiss, half laughter. You did well, Peter. My heart hammered. Betrayal. He'd been working with her all along. That's how he'd survived so long. He lured in or sacrificed other victims to spare himself. Peter, terrified, glanced at me. I'm sorry. He managed to whimper. She made me do it. Mrs. Henderson didn't give him a chance to finish. She sank her teeth into his shoulder, blood spraying across the dusty shed floor. Peter screamed, struggling, but it was futile. The moment her teeth tore into his flesh, he collapsed, eyes rolling back. With a wet, ripping sound, she tossed him aside as though he were trash. Mark's hand gripped my arm. He was trembling violently. We had to get out of there. Acting on pure adrenaline, I searched the dusty tool bench and found a small metal canister labeled kerosene. Next to it was an old lantern. In one swift motion, I yanked off the lantern's top, splashed kerosene over the bench, and fumbled for the matches I'd seen lying near the tools. Mrs. Henderson turned her awful gaze on us. "You're not leaving," she rasped, stepping over Peter's unmoving form. One of her hands ended in long, curved nails, each glinting like a blade in the moonlight. I struck a match and threw it onto the soaked bench. Flames roared up instantly, licking the walls of the shed. Mrs. Henderson shrieked, stumbling back from the heat. Smoke filled the cramped space, and I coughed, grabbing Mark's arm. We staggered out of the shed as fire consumed the old wood. The heat was almost unbearable, but it slowed her down. Keeping an arm around Mark, I half pulled him toward our car. The yard was bathed in flickering orange light from the growing inferno. We reached the car, and I realized the keys were gone. They were probably still in the ignition, or lost in the chaos. I yanked open the driver's door. There they were, in the ignition. Thank God. I'll try to start it, I gasped. I turned the key. The engine groaned. Again I tried. This time it coughed, then roared to life. Relief flooded me. I shoved the passenger door open, and Mark collapsed onto the seat. We sped off, tires kicking up dust and gravel. In the rearview mirror, the shed was engulfed in flames, and I saw Mrs. Henderson stagger outside, silhouetted against the fire. The last thing I glimpsed was her face, twisted in rage, eyes blazing. Then I turned onto the dirt road and never looked back. We drove through the night until we finally found a main highway, where we collapsed at a small roadside motel. The night manager took one look at our bloody, disheveled appearance and called an ambulance. At the hospital, I told the police everything, though I knew it sounded insane. They humored me but showed skepticism. Later, a few officers visited Goose Pond and claimed they found only charred remains of a small outbuilding. There was no farmhouse, no sign of Mrs. Henderson or any wrongdoing, nothing that matched my story. They chalked it up to trauma-induced hallucinations and let the matter drop. Mark recovered slowly. Physically, he had no lasting injuries, but the nightmares lingered. We tried to put it behind us, to move on with our lives. A few weeks later, though, I received a small package with no return address. Inside was a necklace I'd lost that night in the shed. The chain snapped. Attached to it was a piece of paper that read, in neat handwriting, "Come visit anytime." I felt my stomach drop. I don't know if Mrs. Henderson survived the fire, or if something else delivered that package. But I do know this: there are things in this world far more terrifying than we can imagine, hiding in the most unassuming places. And sometimes, when you knock on a stranger's door late at night, you might find yourself trapped in a nightmare that refuses to end. I've never returned to Goose Pond. I don't plan on it. The memory of that night is enough to remind me that some roads are best left untraveled, and some doors should remain forever unopened. I'm telling my story in the hope that it might save someone else. Because if you ever see a light in an old farmhouse out there, in the Indiana backwoods, think twice before you knock. You might not get out alive. My name is Ben Carter. I was 36 when I decided to camp at White Butte in North Dakota, a trip that would straight up change my life in ways I couldn't have even imagined. Back then, I was still reeling from a messy divorce, desperate for some peace and quiet, a place to just think. I'd always heard that White Butte was this remote, lonely peak, perfect for someone who needed to be alone. So, I packed up my beat-up old camping gear and set out with my German Shepherd, Duke. Duke was my best bud, a big, loyal goofball who'd been on countless road trips with me. But he was getting older, and I worried the cold nights might be too much for him. Still, I couldn't leave him behind. He was the only company I trusted. The drive to White Butte took me over dusty roads that stretched across empty fields and rolling badlands. By the time I reached the trailhead, it was late afternoon, and the sun was already dipping toward the horizon. This place felt like the edge of the world. The sky was so huge. It felt like you could fall right off if you walked too far. I was pulling my ratty old tent and single sleeping bag from the trunk when I noticed this woman approaching. She was wearing these well-worn hiking boots and had a small pack slung over her shoulder. Her dark hair was pulled back in a tight bun, and she walked with this confident stride, you know. She called out, smiling brightly, "I'm Ashley Monroe. I'm studying geology for a project at my university. Are you heading up White Butte?" I hesitated. I really didn't want company. "Yeah," I said, keeping it short, hoping she'd get the hint. But she just beamed like I'd invited her to a party. "Great. Mind if I join you for a while?" she asked. "I promise I won't slow you down." I glanced at Duke, who was sniffing the air in her direction. He wasn't growling, but he wasn't wagging his tail either. Something about Ashley's eagerness rubbed me the wrong way. But, I didn't have a real reason to say no. "Sure," I replied with a shrug. "I'm Ben Carter, by the way, and this big guy is Duke." For the first few hours, everything seemed normal enough. Ashley chatted about rock formations and how White Butte was formed. I admitted I didn't know much about geology, though I did enjoy reading about local legends. She seemed really into that, asking what stories I'd heard. When I mentioned the tale of a murdered settler woman who supposedly haunted these parts, Ashley just giggled like it was some silly campfire story. We made camp just before sunset. I realized, with a growing sense of dread, that my gear was barely good enough for the dropping temperatures. My tent was ancient, with these little tiers I hadn't bothered to patch. The sleeping bag was thin, meant for warmer weather. The forecast had said it would be mild, but out here, the wind could whip across the open plains, chilling you to the bone. After dinner, some sad, dehydrated meals eaten around a small fire, I crawled into my tent, Duke right beside me. I could hear Ashley humming cheerfully in her own tent nearby. For some reason, that tune put me on edge, like she was way too comfortable in a place that felt distinctly unwelcoming. That night, I woke up to Duke's low, throaty growl. He was standing at the tent flap, hackles raised. My heart started pounding. "What is it, boy?" I whispered. Then I heard it, a faint humming, eerily similar to the tune Ashley had been humming earlier. But it was distant and echoing, like it was riding the wind from somewhere far away. It made the hair on my arms stand on end. I unzipped the tent slowly, shining my flashlight into the darkness. The beam cut through the night, revealing nothing but the swaying tall grass. But Duke kept growling. He never growled unless something or someone was out there. In the morning, I told Ashley about the weird humming, expecting her to either confirm it or brush it off as nothing. She just gave me this cryptic smile and said she'd slept like a rock. Then, she changed the subject completely. It hit me then that I didn't actually know anything about her school or her research. A prickling sense of doubt started to worm its way into my mind. That afternoon, while we were exploring the base of the butte, I noticed Ashley slip away. She came back a couple of hours later, covered in dirt and sweat, her eyes lit up with this intensity that made my stomach twist. "What were you doing?" I asked, trying to keep my voice casual. "Exploring, like I said. The rock formations here are fascinating." She answered smoothly, but she seemed irritated by my question. "You should mind your own business, Ben." I let it go, but the uneasy feeling just kept growing. Duke seemed wary around Ashley too, never taking his eyes off her. That night, the humming came back, louder this time, more insistent. Duke whined and scratched at the tent floor, like he wanted to get out. But I stayed inside, too freaked out to face whatever was out there. On the third morning, I woke up to find my camping gear scattered all over the place. The plastic plates, water bottles, even Duke's food bowl were strewn in a wide circle around the tent. In the center was this crude symbol etched into the dirt, almost like a spiral that ended in a jagged slash. My pulse went into overdrive at the sight. It definitely wasn't something a curious animal would do. I confronted Ashley, but she just shrugged. "Maybe some local kids wandered by," she said. "Here," I countered. "There's nobody for miles." Ashley just smiled again, but there was no warmth in it this time. It was kind of creepy, to be honest. We had another tense conversation around lunchtime. I was getting ready to head toward a small cave I'd spotted the day before. Maybe I could take some pictures, or do a little exploring myself. But Ashley insisted on tagging along. Something in her eyes, a sharpness, put me on high alert. We ended up hiking into a more secluded area near the base of White Butte, thick with jagged rocks and scraggly brush. The wind had picked up, sending dust swirling into our faces. I was about to tell Ashley we should head back to avoid a storm, when she suddenly stopped and pulled a handgun from her pack. "Drop your stuff," she demanded. Her face had totally changed. All that fake friendliness was gone. "What?" I froze, Duke at my heel. She aimed the gun at me. "You hurt me. I'm not a geology student. My friends and I, we wait for unsuspecting travelers. Usually. I work with a partner, but he's busy taking care of something else. All you need to know is I want your valuables, your truck keys, anything worth money." I raised my hands. "I don't have much, seriously. My wallet's in the tent, and my gear is worthless." "Don't lie to me," she snapped. Duke lunged, barking like crazy. Before he could reach her, she fired a warning shot into the air. The crack echoed through the emptiness. Duke stopped, teeth bared. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it was going to burst out of my chest. "Back," she ordered me, then reached into her pocket, pulled out those plastic zip ties, and tossed them at my feet. "To your feet, then your hands. Hurry up." With trembling fingers, I did what she said. She came closer to tighten the ties. Before I could react, she slammed the butt of her gun against my temple. Pain exploded in my head, and I collapsed, my vision swimming. I could hear Duke barking furiously, but then I heard another shot, and then silence. When I came to, I was tied to a tree trunk, my head throbbing so fiercely I thought I might throw up. Duke was nowhere in sight. I strained against the zip ties, panic flaring. Ashley was gone, and she'd left me to bake in the merciless midday sun. I don't know how long I was out there, but it felt like hours. Eventually, I managed to slip one hand free when the plastic tie snapped against a jagged piece of bark. My wrists were bloody and raw, but I was free. All my gear, including my phone, was gone. My tent and truck keys were presumably back at camp, but I couldn't be sure. The only thing on my mind was finding Duke. I stumbled through the scrub, the sun pounding down. My head ached, and I felt dizzy. Hours later, I spotted Duke limping toward me, a bloody wound on his flank. He whined softly as he approached. "Good boy," I whispered, dropping to my knees to check him out. It looked like a grazing bullet wound, painful, but not immediately life-threatening. Anger surged through me. I needed to get Duke to safety. As the sun dipped low, I realized I was lost. The landscape seemed foreign in every direction, and the shadows stretched out like long, ominous fingers across the barren land. Then, once more, I heard that humming. Only this time it sounded closer, more distinct, like a woman's voice drifting on the breeze. Duke whimpered at my side, cowering. I followed the sound, more out of a lack of options than any real plan. Eventually, I came upon a narrow opening in the side of the butte, just big enough for a person to squeeze through. Duke stayed close. Inside, the cave was musty and cold. My flashlight flickered across the walls, revealing etchings in the rock symbols that looked vaguely like the spiral I'd seen near my campsite. Farther in, I found what looked like a makeshift shrine of bones, dried flowers, melted candles, and a stained journal. Fear turned my stomach as I lifted the book. The yellowed pages contained frantic handwriting about a woman who'd been murdered by her husband on White Butte. The entries became more and more erratic, describing sightings of a ghostly figure in a white dress who could mimic voices and drive people mad with her wailing. That's when I heard footsteps behind me. I whirled around to see Ashley, pale and trembling. She didn't look anything like the confident thief who'd held me at gunpoint. Her eyes were wide with terror. "It's out there," she whispered, pointing toward the entrance. "That humming. It's not me. It's not a person." I backed away, unsure whether to believe her. "You left me tied to a tree. You shot my dog." Her lip trembled. "I heard that thing. I got lost. I came here to hide." A sudden, ear-splitting wail cut through the silence. I doubled over, covering my ears. Duke howled, and Ashley screamed, sinking to her knees. The noise felt like shards of broken glass slicing through my skull. And then, as abruptly as it began, the wail stopped. In the flickering light, I saw her, a woman in a torn white dress, floating at the edge of the cave's darkness. Her hair hung in ragged strands, her face half hidden. But her eyes, those eyes were empty, dark holes that stared with hateful intent. She raised her hand, beckoning us deeper into the cave. Ashley fired a shot, but the woman in white disappeared, leaving only a faint echo of her haunting song. The bullet ricocheted off the rock, throwing sparks. I seized the moment, tackling Ashley and wrenching the gun from her grip. She struggled, but I was fueled by rage and terror. Once I had the gun, I pressed it to her back. "You move, I shoot," I hissed. Before I could decide what to do next, the ghost reappeared, screaming again, driving us both to our knees. When I looked up, the woman in white was hovering mere inches from Ashley. She opened her mouth in a silent snarl. Ashley's eyes rolled back, and she collapsed, blood trickling from her ears. I wanted to run, but some instinct told me the ghost wouldn't just let me leave. I remembered the journal in my hand, flipping frantically through its pages. One passage mentioned burning the settler's final writings to end her hold on this place. With trembling hands, I gathered the candles and the other items strewn around. I lit one candle and set the journal's pages on fire. The flames curled the edges of the paper, releasing a foul smoke that stung my nostrils. The woman in white shrieked, a sound so piercing that I thought my eardrums would burst. Duke cowered against the cave wall, whimpering. The ghost advanced on me, her hollow eyes locked on the burning pages. My vision blurred from the noise, my heart pounding. I forced myself to keep the journal in the flame. The shrieking intensified, then suddenly, the ghost faded, her form dissolving like mist. A final, echoing moan reverberated through the cavern, and then silence. Ashley lay unmoving on the cave floor. I checked her pulse. She was barely alive, her breathing shallow. Even after everything she'd done, I couldn't just leave her there. Gathering my courage, I dragged her out of the cave. Duke limped alongside us, every step seemingly more painful than the last. My only goal was to find my way back to the main trail, to get help, any help. We didn't make it far before stumbling upon a group of local hunters. Relief washed over me, only to vanish the moment I saw the hostility in their eyes and the rifles slung across their shoulders. "Don't move," one of them barked. There were 3 of them, rough looking, and they appeared more frightened than anything else. "You on white butt for a reason." I tried to explain what had happened, that Ashley had robbed me, that there was something supernatural in the cave. The more I spoke, the more their expressions hardened. One of them aimed a rifle at me while the other searched my pockets. "She's the one who's been messing around here?" one hunter asked, pointing at Ashley's limp form. "He killed her, you think?" My heart lurched. "No, she's not dead. She needs a doctor." "What about the rest?" another growled. "We found signs of someone snooping near our property last week. Could be him." They bound my wrists with a rope, ignoring my pleas for reason. Duke snarled. But the men threatened to shoot him if he came any closer. They dragged me and Ashley to a crude hunting shack in a depression between some rocky outcroppings. Inside, it smelled of stale beer and sweat. They chained me to a post, leaving Ashley unconscious on the floor, her wrists loosely tied. One of the hunters spat at my feet. "Stay put till we figure out what to do with you," he said, slamming the door. I sat there for what felt like an eternity, the weight of the day's horrors crushing me. My head still pounded from Ashley's earlier attack. Duke stayed by my side, whining softly. His flank was bleeding again. I promised him we'd get out of this, but even I didn't believe my own words. At some point in the night, I heard the men arguing outside about how to handle us. One wanted to turn us over to the police. Another insisted, no cops. Something about stolen property. Fear gnawed at me. If they decided to kill us and hide our bodies out here, who'd ever know? Desperation surged. I scanned the shack for anything to help me escape. My gaze fell on the wood, burning stove across the room. Faint orange embers glowing in its belly. If I could reach those embers, I might burn through the rope binding my wrists. I waited until the hunters' voices faded, presumably heading off to drink or sleep. Then, I inched closer to the stove, tugging Duke along gently. The rope was long enough that I managed to brace it against the metal edge of the stove, hoping the heat would weaken the fibers. My skin stung as the rope heated, and a sharp burn lanced my wrist, but I bit down on my lip to keep from crying out. Finally, the rope snapped. I was free. My wrists were raw and blistered, but I tried not to think about the pain. I quickly untied Ashley. She was awake but weak, her face drawn. Without her gun, she seemed just as helpless as me. Whatever hatred I felt for her, I couldn't leave her behind to face these hunters alone, assuming she'd even live that long after the encounter with the woman in white. We moved quietly, creeping out of the shack. One of the hunters was on guard nearby, dozing against a tree. I spotted a lantern and a small can of gas at the edge of the camp. An idea sparked in my mind. If I created a distraction, maybe we could slip away. I poured a little gas around the lantern, then struck a match and backed off. The flames erupted, startling the guard awake. He cursed, kicking at the fire, which only spread. In the confusion, I motioned for Ashley and Duke to follow me. We slipped into the night, my heart thundering. We hiked for miles, fear propelling us forward. Duke limped, but he refused to quit. At dawn, we finally stumbled upon a dirt road. My truck was in the distance, apparently abandoned by Ashley, where I had originally set up camp. How she got it there, I had no idea. But the sense of relief was almost overwhelming. The truck, battered and with a broken window, was still drivable. My wallet and phone were gone, but the keys were in the ignition, as if she planned to return for it later. Ashley stood back, pale and trembling. She looked like a completely different person from the woman who had first greeted me with that charming smile. Her gunshot wound to Duke, her betrayal, all of it still churned inside me like bile. She opened her mouth to speak, but I cut her off. "Just go," I said. "I'm taking Duke to a vet. If you cross my path again, I won't hesitate to defend myself." Ashley didn't argue. She turned and walked down the road without another word, leaving me to watch her retreating figure until she disappeared around a bend. Maybe she was heading toward wherever her mysterious partner was, or maybe she was just escaping into the wild. I felt no sympathy for her. My concern lay solely with Duke. I got my wounded dog into the passenger seat. He was shaking, but he rested his head in my lap as I started the engine. I drove as fast as I dared on the unpaved road, hoping to reach a town before Duke's condition worsened. My side mirror revealed a plume of smoke rising from some distant area. Perhaps the hunters' camp was engulfed in flames, or perhaps they managed to contain it. Either way, I was beyond caring. I reached the nearest town by mid-afternoon, half delirious from exhaustion and fear. A local vet patched Duke up, though the bullet graze and subsequent infection left him crippled in his hind leg. The vet quietly asked if I wanted to call the police, but I only nodded, not even sure how to explain the chain of events. By the time the authorities arrived, I was nearly catatonic with fatigue. I told them as much as I could: the betrayal, the kidnapping, the ghost I'd seen. They regarded me with a mix of concern and skepticism. Despite the ghostly element of my story, the police at least took the kidnapping and assault seriously. They promised to check out the area and question any hunters they found. But I knew deep in my bones that they wouldn't find the woman in white. Some things can't be pinned down by patrol cars and paperwork. After giving my statement, I took Duke to a quiet motel, nursing him through the worst of his injuries. His leg would never fully heal, but he was alive, and so was I. Sometimes, late at night, I swear I can still hear that humming. It's a faint sound in the back of my mind, a reminder of how close I came to death in those desolate badlands. As for Ashley, I never saw her again. But I wouldn't be surprised if she's still out there somewhere, searching for her next victim. Or maybe she finally fell prey to the ghosts of White Butte. And the ghost herself, the woman in white. I believe I ended her hold on the cave by burning that journal. But there's a nagging doubt at the edges of my thoughts. Because the land around White Butte feels ancient, haunted by more than just one restless spirit. When I close my eyes sometimes, I see her hollow eyes glaring at me through the darkness, as if to say, I'm not finished yet. I left North Dakota a week later, driving with Duke's head resting on my lap. We were both scarred, physically and mentally, but we were alive. The wind howled across the plains, and just as I passed the sign that read, "You are leaving North Dakota," I thought I heard a faint voice singing on the wind, a lonely, discordant tune that followed me all the way home. Alright, let me tell you about the time my life took a hard left turn into crazy town. My name is Sarah Johnson. I'm 28, and this all went down last August, way up in the Turtle Mountains of North Dakota. You know, that area near the Canadian border where your phone goes to die. That's the place. It was supposed to be this awesome, romantic getaway for me and my boyfriend, Mark. We were so over the noise and stress of our 9 to 5s. We just wanted to unplug, you know. Mark had just hit the big 3 yellow, and he was itching to celebrate by doing something, in his words, epic. I swear. The guy was like a kid on Christmas morning when we were packing up his SUV. We had enough camping gear and food to last a week. On the drive up north, we had to stop for gas at this little, run-down station off Highway 281. The place looked totally deserted, except for this old couple standing by a beat-up pickup truck. The husband gave us this serious stink eye while he was pumping gas. His wife, though, she slowly shuffled over to us. She was frail, her face all wrinkled up like a road map of worry lines. She looked at Mark, then at me, and said, "You two headed to the mountains?" Mark nodded. "Yeah, Turtle Mountains. We're going camping." Her face got even more serious. "Stay on the main trails," she warned us. "Don't go exploring too far. People sometimes disappear." Okay, I'll admit it. A chill went down my spine. The way she said it, it was like she wasn't just some overprotective local. She sounded genuinely scared. But Mark, he just gave her a polite, "Thank you, Mom. We'll be fine." In the car, he just shrugged it off, calling it local superstition. I tried to smile, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. By late afternoon, we rolled into our campsite. Mark had found it on some wilderness forum, and it was way off the beaten path, surrounded by these massive old-growth pines and tons of underbrush. The air was so fresh it almost smelled sweet. At first, it seemed perfect. Secluded, we set up the tent, and Mark was humming, snapping pictures with his fancy camera, like he was on assignment for National Geographic. I tried to relax, telling myself that the old lady at the gas station was just trying to spook us. The first night was actually pretty great. We cooked hot dogs over a little fire, passed a flask of whiskey back and forth. We talked about the future, the usual stuff. Maybe moving somewhere more peaceful, maybe starting a family. The sky was crystal clear, full of stars. The only sounds were crickets and the hooting of an owl every now and then. I slept like a baby, all warm and cozy next to Mark. It was the second night when everything went sideways. It all started because we decided to hike deeper into the woods the next day. Mark was obsessed with finding this hidden lake that was supposedly way off the main trails. He had some GPS coordinates he got from some online forum. I was hesitant, especially after what that old woman said. But Mark was so excited, and I didn't want to be the one to rain on his parade. The hike was long and confusing. The trees were so thick overhead that only little bits of sunlight got through. We stumbled upon these abandoned cabins that looked like they hadn't been touched in decades. The roofs were caved in, and they just had this creepy vibe. The air got colder the further we went, and I started feeling really isolated, like we were the only people left on Earth. By dusk, we were nowhere near that damn lake. Mark was getting frustrated, messing with his GPS, which kept glitching out. He started getting irritable, snapping at me when I asked if we should head back. That wasn't like him at all. Usually, he was the chill one. I decided not to push it. We set up camp by a little stream, made a makeshift fire pit. Mark was quiet, obviously bummed about not finding the lake. We ate a sad dinner of canned beans and beef jerky. Then, we heard footsteps in the distance. We both froze listening. A guy came out from behind a bunch of trees. At first I thought, oh, another camper. But when he stepped into the firelight, I realized something was off. He was way too put together. His clothes looked like he was going to a business meeting, not hiking in the woods. Dark slacks, a crisp shirt, and these shoes that didn't have a speck of mud on them. He introduced himself as, get this, Felix. His voice was all smooth, and he had this accent I couldn't place. It was like he'd lived everywhere and nowhere at the same time. And his eyes, they were this weird silver color that caught the firelight in a creepy way. Mark, being Mr. Social, invited Felix to join us by the fire. The guy accepted with this little nod, like we were doing him a favor. The three of us talked for a while, but I mostly just listened. Felix talked in circles about old legends of the woods, people being lured away by mysterious forces. He seemed really knowledgeable, almost like a professor or something. At one point, he turned to Mark and said, "You seek something you cannot name. An adventure to prove your worth, yes." Mark looked both amused and creeped out. "I'm just looking for a lake," he joked. "Proof of worth can come later." Felix smiled, showing these teeth that were way too white. "There are secrets deeper than any lake in these woods. Perhaps you'll find more than you bargained for." Something about Felix put me on edge, but Mark seemed fascinated. When Felix offered to guide us to a better campsite, Mark agreed without even asking me. I didn't argue, because we really didn't know the area. And maybe the stranger could help us get back to a known trail in the morning. We put out the fire and followed him. The moon was hiding behind clouds, making these weird shadows all around us. The further we walked, the more the air felt different. The nice pine smell was gone, replaced by this stale odor like rotting leaves. I tried to talk to Mark, but he was laser focused on Felix's back like he was in some kind of trance. Eventually, we got to this small clearing. Felix pointed to it with a flourish. "Camp here. You'll be safe." He stood there in silence for a minute, then his gaze landed on me. "You're wary, Sarah. I can sense it." I opened my mouth to say something, but nothing came out. How did he know my name? We hadn't done full introductions. Mark must have mentioned me, I told myself. But looking back, I'm pretty sure he hadn't. Before I could ask him about it, Felix bowed his head, all formal-like. "I'll leave you two for now, but I'll be nearby if you need me." And then, he just vanished into the darkness. I still don't know how he walked away so quietly. No snapping twigs, no rustling leaves. Just gone. That night, Mark and I had our first real fight. I asked him why he was so willing to follow a complete stranger. He snapped back that I was being paranoid. We were both tired, and something about that clearing felt really wrong. It was too perfect, a circle. The trees were too evenly spaced. It reminded me of something you'd see in a movie about rituals or something. But I kept that thought to myself. Despite the seriously bad vibes, we managed to fall asleep. I woke up a few hours later to this low humming sound, almost like chanting. I crawled out of the tent, and the whole clearing was lit up by this weird, pale light that didn't seem to be coming from anywhere specific. My heart was pounding out of my chest when I saw Felix standing at the edge of the trees, just staring at me. He didn't move, didn't speak, just stared. I backed into the tent and shook Mark awake, but by the time we both looked out, Felix was gone. Mark was pissed, thinking I'd just had a nightmare. I wasn't so sure. By morning, things went from bad to worse. Our campsite had been trashed. Food was thrown everywhere. Our tent was slashed, and the water containers were tipped over. One of them smelled like someone had dumped gasoline in it. Mark was cursing up a storm, thinking it was raccoons or some local kids messing with us. But deep down, I wondered if Felix was behind it. It didn't make any sense, but I couldn't shake the feeling. We decided to hike back to our original campsite, but when Mark tried to use his GPS, it wouldn't even turn on. My phone had zero reception, which wasn't unusual for out there, but it also refused to power up. We were officially cut off. Felix showed up again around noon, offering to help. "It's easy to get turned around in these woods," he said. "Let me guide you to higher ground, where you'll find your bearings." I figured Mark would tell him to take a hike, but once again, Mark agreed. He gave me this look, half apology, half defiance, and shrugged. "We have to get out of here somehow," he said. So, we followed Felix, who led us through this maze of twisting paths. The whole time, my nerves were shot. I kept hearing rustling noises behind us. But whenever I turned around, there was nothing there. I also noticed that Mark's mood seemed to get darker. It was like he was simmering with anger at me for not trusting Felix. At one point, Felix turned and gave me this knowing smirk, like he could sense the wedge he was driving between us. The real nightmare started as it was getting dark. Felix brought us to another clearing, similar to the last one, only this one wasn't empty. In the center was this small stone altar, all blackened with something that looked like old bloodstains. There were animal bones scattered all around, and the smell of decay was so strong I almost gagged. Felix turned to us with that too perfect smile. "A sacred place," he said, all soft and reverent. "Here we can discuss a bargain." "What are you talking about?" I asked, my voice trembling. His silver eyes locked onto Mark. "I can give you anything you desire. Wealth, power, recognition, whatever you crave, but you must be willing to pay." Mark stared at him, confused and alarmed. "You're insane, man. We just want to go home." Felix tilted his head. "Home is far away, Mark. Too far. Unless you accept my guidance." Then he started rattling off details he had no business knowing. Mark's job frustrations, the tension in our relationship, my reluctance to get married. It was all so personal, so invasive. My stomach was twisting itself into knots. "Stop it," Mark warned, his fists clenched. "I don't know what kind of game you're playing." Felix's expression hardened. "This is no game." Suddenly, shadows moved at the tree line. Dozens of them, like living silhouettes. They surged forward, overwhelming Mark before he could even react. They pinned him to the ground. I screamed and tried to reach him, but some invisible force shoved me backward. I hit the ground hard, my vision swimming. When I came to, I was in an old, run-down cabin, tied to a wooden chair. My wrists were tied with this rough rope that was digging into my skin. The air was stale and foul, and dust motes were floating in the dim light. Mark was nowhere in sight. I struggled against the ropes, calling his name until my throat was raw. The door creaked open, and Felix stepped in, looking as unruffled and elegant as ever. He circled me, his steps completely silent. "Sarah," he said, his voice dripping with fake concern. "I'm sorry it has come to this, but Mark refuses to see reason." "Where is he?" I demanded. Felix smiled. "Have him elsewhere. He's resistant, but I'll break him eventually. Unless you want to help me." His words made my blood run cold. "You're a monster." He leaned in close, and I saw something in his eyes that looked like hunger. "Think of me as an educator. I teach people their limits. Mark will learn his, in time." Then he left and I was alone. Over the next few hours, or maybe it was days, time didn't make sense in that cabin. I heard distant screams echoing through the forest. I prayed it wasn't Mark, but deep down I knew it was. Sometimes between the screams I heard chanting. Other times I heard what sounded like Mark sobbing or calling my name. Finally, in a burst of pure desperation, I managed to work the rope loose from the arm of the chair. The wood was old, and the rope had cut partway through it. With enough twisting and pulling, I freed my right hand, then fumbled to undo the rest. My wrists were raw and bleeding, but I barely felt the pain. Creeping out of the cabin was terrifying. I had no idea where Felix or those shadowy things might be. The woods were eerily silent, blanketed in darkness. I moved as quietly as I could, scanning the area for anything that might help me find Mark. Then, I saw a faint glow coming from deeper in the forest. I followed it, and it led me to another clearing, even bigger than the last one. Torches ringed the perimeter, casting this flickering light on a horrifying scene. Mark was tied to a tall, twisted tree in the center. His shirt was torn, and his skin was marked with bruises and cuts. Felix stood before him, speaking in some language I didn't understand. The shadowy figures stood in a circle, swaying in time with Felix's words. Summoning every ounce of courage I had, I crept behind the nearest torch. My mind was racing. I needed a weapon, some way to distract Felix. I spotted a large branch on the ground. It wasn't much, but it would have to do. Felix finished his chanting and turned to Mark. I can end your suffering. All you have to do is give me Sarah. Betray her, let her pay the price. Mark's breathing was ragged. No, he spat, his voice cracking. I won't, Felix sighed, feigning disappointment. Then your soul is mine regardless. My heart was hammering. I had one shot at this. I clenched the branch tight and lunged from behind the torch, swinging with all my strength. The branch connected with Felix's back, sending him stumbling forward. But the impact felt wrong, like I'd hit something way harder than flesh and bone. He staggered, then turned, and for a split second, his eyes glowed this fiery red. Mark shouted, "Run, Sarah." But I couldn't just leave him there. Ignoring Felix's furious gaze, I rushed to Mark, hacking at the ropes with the jagged edge of the branch until they started to fray. Felix moved inhumanly fast, grabbing me by the throat and hurling me to the ground. My head spun, and I tasted blood in my mouth. "Stubborn," he hissed. "I admire that, but it's wasted here." The shadowy figures moved closer, forming a tight ring around us. For a moment, I thought we were done for. But Mark, fueled by pure desperation, tore free of the partially cut ropes and tackled Felix from behind, sending the guy sprawling. "Sarah, go!" he yelled again. But instead of running alone, I grabbed his arm, and together we broke through the ring of shadowy minions. They felt cold and insubstantial, like grabbing at smoke, but they clawed and grabbed at us. Somehow, we tore free, plunging into the dark woods. We ran blindly, branches lashing at our faces, our lungs burning. The night seemed endless, and the forest itself felt like it was twisting around us, trying to keep us trapped. Eventually, we found a narrow dirt path and followed it until we stumbled across a rusted wire fence. Beyond it, I saw a lonely dirt road. Mark collapsed, wheezing. His injuries were bad. Deep cuts across his torso, a gash on his forehead. He was losing a lot of blood. I tried to keep him conscious, pressing my shaking hands to his wounds, trying to stop the bleeding. "I'm okay," he rasped, but his eyes kept fluttering. We made it. We forced ourselves to keep moving, using the fence as a guide. After what felt like hours, the road led to a small homestead, a beat-up trailer and a barn that looked like it was about to collapse. I banged on the trailer door, praying someone was inside. A single porch light flickered on, and an old, grizzled man opened the door a crack. The first thing I saw was the shotgun in his hands. "You best have a good reason to be here," he growled. "Please," I sobbed. "My boyfriend's hurt. We need help." He eyed Mark's wounds, and his expression shifted from suspicion to grim concern. "Get him inside." He helped me lay Mark on a threadbare couch. The man introduced himself as Dale, an ex-soldier who'd come to live off-grid to escape what he called the madness of the world. Little did he know, we'd brought a whole new kind of madness right to his doorstep. He fetched some basic medical supplies, bandages, antiseptic, some old painkillers, and we did our best to treat Mark's wounds. I told Dale about Felix. I told him everything, expecting him to laugh or call me crazy. Instead, he listened quietly, then said, "I've heard tales of devils in these hills. Folks around here don't speak of them freely. You're lucky to be alive." Mark's breathing steadied a bit, but he was far from okay. We decided to stay the night. Dale said he'd drive us to the nearest hospital in the morning, though it was nearly an hour away on rough roads. That night, I took the first watch, terrified Felix would find us. Through the grimy window, I kept expecting to see those silver eyes, but all was quiet, save for a distant wind rattling the trailer. Dawn broke without incident, and I almost believed we were safe. As Dale started up his old pickup truck, I heard a sound that made my blood run cold. Laughter. itching across the empty fields. It was Felix, standing at the edge of the property. Even from a distance, I could make out his unnatural, rigid stance. The wind whipped his shirt and hair, but he stood there unfazed, smiling at me as if to say, "This isn't over. Jet in now." Dale shouted. I scrambled into the passenger seat, while Mark lay groaning in the back. The truck roared to life, kicking up dust as we tore down the dirt road. I glanced back once, and Felix was gone. But I felt his presence, like he was lurking in the tree line, waiting for the right moment to strike. We bounced along the road for what felt like forever. Dale was focused on driving, muttering curses whenever the truck threatened to stall. My eyes kept darting to the rearview mirror, half expecting to see Felix sprinting after us or flying overhead. It was irrational, maybe, but after everything I'd witnessed, I couldn't dismiss any possibility. When we finally reached a paved highway, my phone buzzed to life. I dialed 911, my hands shaking so badly I could barely hold the phone. An operator picked up, and I tried my best to explain our location and Mark's condition. We agreed to meet an ambulance near a rest stop about 15 miles down the road. We reached the rendezvous point, and I watched helplessly as the paramedics loaded Mark onto a stretcher. He was pale and barely conscious but alive. They asked me questions. What happened? Where? We were attacked. My answers must have seemed absurd, but they didn't press too hard, focusing instead on stabilizing Mark. I rode in the ambulance with him, leaving Dale behind. He refused payment, only saying, "Get yourselves out of these mountains and don't come back." His words struck me as both a warning and a plea. The hospital staff treated Mark's injuries, but they didn't believe our story. The police took a statement, chalking up our account to a delusional reaction caused by stress and possibly dehydration or exposure. They considered the possibility that a deranged individual had attacked us, but the mention of silver eyes, shadowy figures, and chanting rituals made them suspicious of our mental state. Mark spent a week in the hospital recovering. He had cracked ribs, multiple lacerations, and a nasty concussion. I stayed by his side the whole time, haunted by nightmares every time I closed my eyes. Sometimes, I'd wake up convinced I saw Felix watching me from the corner of the hospital room. Of course, there was never anyone there. When Mark was finally discharged, we drove straight home, hardly speaking a word the entire trip. The closeness we once shared felt fragile, tainted by the trauma. Neither of us had the energy to address it. For weeks, we avoided talking about what happened. Eventually, we tried to rationalize it, blaming the stress of the trip, our own poor decisions, maybe a crazy local who'd taken advantage of us. But no matter how hard we tried, we couldn't explain Felix. Mark never fully recovered, mentally. He quit his job as soon as he returned, saying he couldn't concentrate anymore. Sleep was nearly impossible for him. He'd wake up screaming, convinced he was still tied to that tree in the clearing, with Felix chanting in his ear. As for me, I went back to teaching, but I was a shell of my former self. My nights were plagued by nightmares of silver-eyed figures. Sometimes I'd see them in my peripheral vision, while walking down the street or shopping for groceries, only to blink and find nothing there. I began to dread even the sight of heavily wooded areas. We tried therapy, together and separately. It helped a little, but the scars, physical and emotional, remained. One evening, after a particularly rough flashback, Mark and I decided we had to move away. Maybe out of state. Someplace without thick forests and isolated mountains. We sold most of our belongings and left North Dakota behind. That was only 3 months ago. It's now January, and we're in a small apartment in a sprawling city, hoping to lose ourselves in the crowd. Mark is a bit better. He's found a new job that keeps him busy. We try to distract ourselves from the horrors we experienced, But I can't lie. Every so often, I catch him staring out the window, eyes dark with memories best left forgotten. I still dream of Felix. In my dreams, he's standing in that clearing, under a blood-red moon, smiling as he holds out a contract for me to sign in my own blood. Sometimes I wake up with tears on my cheeks, grateful it was just a dream. Other times, I'm not so sure. I've never fully told anyone else what happened out there in the Turtle Mountains. The authorities dismissed it, the doctors rationalized it, and the few people I've confided in just nod sympathetically. Most assume we're exaggerating a backwoods assault. Maybe that's for the best. The truth is too unbelievable, and I don't need another person looking at me like I'm crazy. Yet, there are nights, in the hush of my new big city apartment, when I hear a faint whisper, an impossible whisper that sounds like a single word. Sarah. That's when my skin crawls, and I know without a shadow of a doubt that Felix is still out there, waiting, watching. Maybe he'll always be with us, a reminder of the evil lurking in the dark corners of the world. And maybe, one day, he'll come calling again. My name is Alex Reed, I'm 29, and I'm not exactly what you'd call outdoorsy. I'm more of a stay inside with a good book and maybe some takeout kind of guy. But a string of seriously bad decisions led me to the most messed up experience of my entire life. It all went down near this place called Ravens Hollow in Illinois, a place where old stories about outlaws and ghosts are, like, part of the air everyone breathes under the thick, spooky forest. I'm telling you all this hoping someone will believe me, and maybe, just maybe, someone else won't make the same dumb mistakes I did. So, picture this. I'd just gotten out of a relationship that left me feeling like a wrung-out dishcloth. Drained, defeated, and desperate for something to change. Enter my best friend Ben. He's 28, a total adrenaline junkie with a weird obsession with urban legends and, well, anything creepy and unexplained. He was all like, "Dude, we need to get away, clear our heads." He suggested a camping trip, which, I gotta admit, sounded awful. But he also kept dropping hints about filming stuff for his little paranormal YouTube channel, trying to play it cool like it was no big deal. I was super hesitant, but I was so desperate to get away from the city, which was just full of reminders of my ex, that I said yes. Biggest stake ever. We rolled into Ravens Hollow on a Friday afternoon in late spring. The town was tiny, like, blink and you'll miss it tiny. A couple of run-down shops, a greasy spoon diner that looked like it hadn't changed since the 50s, and a historical marker pointing to the famous cave by the Ohio River. I immediately felt this weird vibe, like a low hum of unease. But Ben, he was practically vibrating with excitement. His eyes were all lit up, like he was a kid in a candy store, except the candy was potential ghost sightings. We drove down this gravel road into the middle of nowhere, our car bouncing all over the place. I swear, I winced every time the car made a weird noise. Ben kept saying he knew where he was going, that he'd done his research. Finally, we pulled into this clearing surrounded by these huge, gnarled trees. It looked okay for a campsite, I guess, but something felt off. It was way too quiet. No birds singing, no wind, just dead silence. As we were unpacking, I noticed the tent Ben had bought was, like, laughably thin. The kind you'd get at a dollar store. Our flashlights were these cheap plastic things. And the sleeping bags looked like they wouldn't even keep you warm on a summer night. I called Ben out on the crappy gear, and he just shrugged it off. "We're only here for 2 nights, he said. "No need to go crazy." That was the first red flag. The first sign that we were seriously unprepared for what was coming. That first night, we set up camp and built a little fire. Ben started telling me all these local legends. Pirates used to use the cave to lure people in, rob them. and then dump their bodies in the river. He also went on and on about these things they called skinwalkers or shapeshifters, supposed to be seen all the time in the area. He talked about them with this weird kind of reverence, like he actually wanted them to be real. I tried to laugh it off, but I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. When we finally crawled into our flimsy tent, I couldn't fall asleep. Every little snap of a twig had me jumping out of my skin, and Ben was tossing and turning all night. I must have drifted off eventually, because the next thing I knew, I was jolted awake by this insane screaming coming from somewhere in the distance. It was high-pitched echoing, and just wrong. Ben shot up, eyes wide. What the hell was that? I asked, my heart pounding in my chest. Ben fumbled for his flashlight, his hand shaking as he tried to turn it on. Could be an animal, he muttered, but even he didn't sound convinced. We got out of the tent, scanning the tree line. The screaming kept going, but it was like it was moving, jumping from place to place. Like whatever was making that sound was circling us. Then, just as suddenly as it started, it stopped. Dead silence again. Looking back, we should have packed up and left right then. We should have gotten in the car and driven as far away from Raven's Hollow as possible, but we didn't. We told ourselves it was just some animal, or maybe some kids messing around. We crawled back into our tent, but neither of us slept much the rest of the night. The next morning, we decided to explore. Yeah, I know, brilliant idea. Ben was all fired up about getting some killer footage for his YouTube channel. About half a mile in, we stumbled on another campsite, or what was left of it. It was a total wreck. Tents ripped to shreds, scattered around a burned-out fire pit. There were these huge claw marks on the fabric, and dark stains all over the ground that looked suspiciously like blood. At first, I thought maybe it was just some teenagers messing around, or maybe a bear or something got in there. But then I saw this old sleeping bag, half buried under some leaves. It was slashed open, the stuffing inside shredded, and the whole area smelled like old blood and something else. Something rotten. Ben was filming the whole thing, eyes wide with a mixture of fear and excitement, while I stood there, my stomach churning. I wanted to call the cops, but of course, we had 0 cell service. Our best bet was to go back to the car and drive into town, but Ben, in his infinite wisdom, convinced me we should finish scouting the area. We need solid proof, Alex, he said, ignoring the look of pure dread on my face. People always say these places are haunted, but no one ever has any real footage. If we can document this, it'll blow up. So, like an idiot, I followed him. We started walking down this narrow deer trail, and the wind started to pick up, carrying these faint sounds of movement. The forest felt like it was closing in on us, the shadows stretching out like long, bony fingers. Then, out of nowhere, we heard the scream again. This time it sounded like a woman's voice, begging for help. Ben took off running before I could even say anything, his camera bouncing around in his hand. I chased after him, but the voice always seemed just out of reach. He vanished. I was sprinting, yelling his name until my throat was raw. Finally, after what felt like hours, I found him. He was slumped against a tree, panting, covered in sweat. There was a huge gash on his right arm, like something had clawed him. He looked up at me, eyes wild. "We have to get back to camp," he whispered, his voice barely audible. That night, Ben was a wreck. He kept pacing around our little fire, muttering about seeing something in the woods. Something tall, pale, and hunched over. He said it moved super fast, darting between the trees. He claimed it had these empty black eyes and a grin that was way too wide. I tried to catch it on camera. He rasped, but it ran at me, slashed my arm. I tried to get him to tell me more, but he just shook his head, refusing to say anything else. Instead, he showed me this weird charm thing he'd found near the destroyed campsite. It was like a little twisted figure made of twigs, wrapped in bits of fabric and hair. I got chills just looking at it. Why would you pick that up? I demanded, totally creeped out. It's probably some kind of ritual thing. Ben shrugged, nervously tapping it against his leg. It's evidence, Alex. Might be the cause of all this. That doesn't mean you keep it. I reached out to grab it, and he pulled away. We started arguing, my frustration boiling over. I mean, how reckless could this guy be? We almost came to blows, but eventually. Ben shoved the charm into his backpack, muttering that he'd get rid of it later. I told him we were packing up and leaving first thing in the morning, and this time, he didn't argue. Despite our plan to leave, we both somehow managed to drift off into a restless sleep, our bodies exhausted from all the stress and adrenaline. Sometime past midnight, I woke up to a noise right outside the tent. It sounded like footsteps, but they were light and uneven, like an injured animal limping. I fumbled for my flashlight, but instead of Ben lying next to me, the spot was empty. A cold sweat broke out on my skin. I scrambled out of the tent and saw him standing a few feet away, his shoulders hunched. The moonlight caught the glint of something in his hand, a knife. Ben, I called out softly, my voice trembling. He turned around slowly, his eyes reflecting the pale light. Without a word, he lunged at me. I reacted on pure instinct, sidestepping and grabbing his wrist, trying to keep the blade away from my chest. He was crazy strong, his face totally blank, like he wasn't even there. I managed to twist his arm until he dropped the knife. Then he blinked, and it was like he was waking up from a trance. Confusion flickered across his face. Alex, he gasped, his voice hoarse like he'd been screaming. He stumbled backward. What happened? I stared into his eyes, searching for any sign that this was some kind of sick joke, but all I saw was fear and confusion. He had no memory of attacking me. My nerves were completely fried at this point. Whatever was going on here, it wasn't just stories or an overactive imagination. I told him we had to leave, right now. But when we got to where our car was parked, the keys and our GPS were gone. The passenger door was open, but there was no sign of forced entry. Panic clawed its way up my throat as I realized we were trapped. Our phones were useless without a signal, and there was no way we could navigate out of those woods in the dark on foot. The next few hours are a blur of tense silence. We huddled by the dying fire, too scared to even try to find the keys. Every now and then, Ben would mumble apologies, insisting he'd never hurt me on purpose. He was pale, sweating like crazy, and clearly running a fever. I noticed him glancing at his backpack every so often, like that creepy charm inside was calling to him. Exhaustion eventually won, and I must have dozed off again. I don't know how long I was out, but I jerked awake to find my mouth dry, my hands tied with rope, and a gag stuffed in my mouth. Shock and confusion hit me like a tidal wave as I realized I was being dragged through the forest. The figure in front of me was moving with terrifying speed, occasionally glancing back. The only light came from the moon, casting these eerie, dancing shadows on the ground. I thrashed, trying to scream, but the gag muffled my cries. My captor's grip was like iron. I caught glimpses of pale, twisted skin inhuman. Finally, we reached a small cave entrance. The air inside reeked of decay and something else, something sickly sweet that made my stomach roll. My head was spinning as I was shoved inside. The cave opened into a cramped chamber, and the floor was littered with bones, old bones. I saw scraps of clothing and torn backpacks among the debris, and my mind reeled. People had been brought here before, and they never left. The thing that had taken me disappeared into the darkness, leaving me tied to a stalagmite. My wrists burned against the rope as I struggled, Minutes or maybe hours passed before I heard a faint voice. It was Ben, screaming for help. I strained my ears, trying to figure out where he was. Then, the creature returned. In the dim light, I could see it more clearly now. It was vaguely human-shaped, but the limbs were too long, too thin. The face was a grotesque mockery of a human's, with empty black eyes and a grin that stretched way too far across its face. It whispered my name, the voice distorted, like multiple voices speaking at once. I felt my heart hammering against my ribs. Then, it vanished again, leaving me alone in the suffocating darkness. Summoning every ounce of willpower I had left, I worked at the rope binding my wrists. The rough surface of the stalagmite actually helped, fraying the rope fibers. After what felt like an eternity, the rope snapped. My ankles were still tied, but I managed to loosen the knots enough to shuffle around. I couldn't see Ben anywhere in the main chamber, so I started inching deeper into the cave, ignoring the stench of rot that clung to the damp walls. Eventually, I found him in a smaller cavern, tied to a natural pillar. His eyes were closed, and there was dried blood on his forehead. I crawled over to him and shook him awake. "Alex," he mumbled, his voice thick with pain. "It took the charm. Said I broke some rule." I couldn't process what he was saying. We just needed to get out of there. I started untying him when we heard a low hiss echoing from behind us. Spinning around, I saw the creature crouched at the entrance of the small cavern, its eyes gleaming in the darkness. I forced myself not to scream, desperately searching my surroundings for anything I could use as a weapon. A jagged piece of rock lay nearby. I snatched it up and threw it at the creature. It hissed louder, recoiling slightly, which gave me just enough time to hoist Ben's arm over my shoulder. We half ran, half limped through the twisting tunnel, adrenaline flooding my veins. We burst out of the cave into the cold pre-dawn air. My muscles were screaming, but I refused to slow down. Ben kept mumbling incoherently about the charm, repeating words like "ate" and "curse." Suddenly, he jerked, pulling away from my grip. I turned to see his eyes roll back in his head, his mouth gaping open. He was looking past me, into the darkness of the forest. Before I could react, a shape slammed into him, knocking me to the ground. My flashlight flew out of my hand, rolling away into the darkness. The creature wrapped its long, bony fingers around Ben's torso and dragged him into the tree line. He screamed, a blood-curdling sound that echoed in my head. I tried to scramble after them, but my body refused to move fast enough. Within seconds, they were gone. The forest fell silent again, leaving me on my hands and knees, breathless and shaking. I thought about trying to track them, but I was delirious, bleeding from my wrists and ankles. My only chance was to escape and get help. With no sense of direction, I stumbled through the woods, scraping my arms and legs on branches. I must have walked for hours, guided by sheer desperation and the faint light of dawn. When the sky finally started to lighten, I spotted a dirt road. Relief washed over me, so intense it almost brought me to my knees. I followed the road until I found a rusted sign that said, "Ravens Hollow State Park, exit." Exhausted, I trudged along until a pickup truck appeared. I waved frantically, nearly collapsing in front of it. An older guy, probably in his 60s, jumped out. He took one look at me and helped me into the truck bed, offering me some water. He drove me to a small gas station near the main highway and called the local authorities. I was rushed to a nearby clinic. I told the police everything, the screams, the campsite, the creature, Ben's abduction. They exchanged these uneasy glances, telling me they'd send out a search party. They looked for Ben for days. They found the remains of our campsite and the abandoned vehicles, but no sign of him. The only thing they recovered was Ben's backpack, half submerged in a creek. The weird twig charm was missing. The police questioned me for hours, clearly suspecting foul play, or that I'd had some kind of mental breakdown. Part of me wished it was just a hallucination, that I'd imagined the whole thing. But my cuts and bruises were real, my memories were vivid, and Ben was gone. I went back home a broken man, with no closure, no answers. Days turned into weeks, and then one morning, I opened my front door to find a small package on my porch. No return address. Inside was that same twig charm Ben had found, the one he said was evidence. Only this time, it was covered in fresh blood. My heart nearly stopped. I realized then that whatever was lurking in those woods might not be confined to Raven's Hollow. It might still be out there, hunting, playing some twisted game that I was now a part of. At night, I sometimes hear tapping on my windows, followed by faint whispers that sound like Ben calling my name. I've tried moving, seeing therapists, even considered leaving Illinois altogether. But I can never truly escape the knowledge of what's out there, or the guilt that I survived when Ben didn't. So, if you ever find yourself wandering near Raven's Hollow, remember my story. Trust your instincts, be prepared, and for God's sake, don't go looking for legends you aren't ready to face. You might not be as lucky as I was. My name's Dave Miller, I'm 33, and what I'm about to tell you happened in Giant City State Park, Illinois. It's this place I always thought was just another pretty spot for a weekend getaway. You know, people go there to hike around those crazy tall rock things, look at birds, or just get away from the city for a bit. I never in a million years thought it would turn into the kind of nightmare that still makes me wake up in a cold sweat. It was supposed to be an anniversary trip for me and my girlfriend, Sarah Jenkins, who's 30. I'd rented this cozy little cabin tucked way back in the woods. We were thinking, like, romantic dinners by the fireplace, lazy mornings with coffee and the sound of birds, maybe a few quiet hikes. Sounds perfect, right? Well, here's where I messed up. I invited my buddy Greg Palmer, he's 34, and his fiancée Lisa Reynolds, she's 28, to come along. Greg had been itching to get out of the city for ages, especially to celebrate his engagement, and I figured, hey, the more the merrier. A few days in the wilderness, what could go wrong? Famous last words, I guess. Things started getting weird right from the get-go. For starters, Greg, being the thrifty guy he is, insisted on bringing the cheapest gear you could find. His flashlights looked like they'd die if you even breathed on them, and the sleeping bags were thinner than my grandma's old blankets. I remember telling him, dude, we're going into a state park in the fall. The weather can change fast out there. He just laughed it off, saying he'd lived through worse. I tried to just let it go, even though I was already starting to stress as we crammed all our stuff into my SUV. We got to the cabin late afternoon. It was this old, but kind of charming place. Small, you know, with a little living area, 2 bedrooms, and a porch that looked out into the thick woods of Giant City. The whole place smelled like damp leaves and moss, that kind of earthy smell. Sarah was stoked at first, but I could see a little bit of tension in her eyes. She gave me this half-joking, half-serious look and said, "Romantic getaways are kind of different with company, Dave." I promised her we'd still have our alone time, if not that night, then soon. Lisa seemed pretty quiet, almost shy. She stuck close to Greg, who was already boasting about how he'd brought all this awesome stuff for a bonfire. After a quick dinner, we settled in, trying to enjoy the quiet of the forest. It was kind of eerie but peaceful, you know. But then, when night came, that's when the first of many messed up things happened. I woke up to this long, drawn-out cry that just cut through the silence like a knife. It was freaky, almost human, like a woman wailing out in the woods. My heart was pounding out of my chest. Sarah shut up in bed, her eyes wide as saucers. We just stared at each other. Animal, right? I said, but I wasn't even sure myself. She didn't say anything. From the other bedroom, I heard Lisa ask in this tiny voice, "Did you guys hear that?" Nobody really slept after that. Then, in the morning, the weirdest thing happened. I went outside to grab some firewood, and there was this long, silver strand of hair wrapped around the cabin's doorknob. It was almost glowing in the daylight. It was that bright. Sarah came up behind me, and she just put her hand over her mouth. "It's probably just the wind," I mumbled, even though that made zero sense. Greg joined us, squinting at the hair and just shrugged. "Kids messing around, maybe," he said, but there was no humor in his voice. We were all starting to feel pretty creeped out. We spent most of that day hiking on a nearby trail. It was muddy from rain, and our boots kept slipping on these slick stones. The forest was super dense, the kind that just eats up sound until you feel like you're the only person left on Earth. We saw these weird piles of rocks along the way, all arranged in spirals and circles, with twigs and moss too. The air around those piles was freezing cold, and there was this faint, rotten smell that made my stomach turn. Even though the sun was shining through the trees, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching us. It was just little things, you know. A rustle in the leaves when there was no wind. The feeling of movement out of the corner of your eye. Sarah, she's always been the sensitive one. She noticed it too. She kept saying she heard whispers in the wind. "You're just spooked from last night." I tried to tell her. She nodded, but she didn't look convinced. When we got back to the cabin that evening, that's when we realized stuff was missing. Sarah's necklace, a gift I'd given her years ago, was gone from the bedside table. And Lisa found her engagement ring in the ashes of the fire pit outside. How it got there, nobody could explain. That was the first time I heard Lisa raise her voice. "Greg, this isn't funny," she yelled, tears in her eyes. He swore up and down he had nothing to do with it. Things got tense fast. Greg and I got into this huge argument about the missing gear and his crappy flashlights that were already starting to flicker. Sarah tried to play peacemaker, and Lisa just stood there, looking totally freaked out. That night, the wailing came again. This time it was so loud it rattled the windows. We turned off all the lights and just huddled in the dark, waiting for it to stop. Sleep. Forget about it. By morning, Greg was a total wreck. He hadn't shaved, there were dark circles under his eyes, and he was jumpy as a cat in a room full of rocking chairs. He claimed he'd heard voices calling his name outside during the night, but when he went to check it out, there was nothing there. Lisa was freaked, and she asked him, trembling, "Why would you even go outside alone?" Greg snapped back at her, saying he didn't need a lecture from her. Sarah and I exchanged this uneasy look. We were all starting to lose it. Later that afternoon, Greg and I got into another fight. Honestly, the details are kind of blurry now. It was something about him wanting to go off on a solo hike to clear his head, and me telling him it was way too dangerous, especially with the weird weather and all the freaky noises at night. He brushed me off, like always, and just took off into the trees with his barely working flashlight and no map. That was the last time I saw him looking even remotely normal. When it got dark and he still wasn't back, the rain started pouring down, and the wind was howling like crazy. It was whipping around the cabin, making the whole place creak and groan. We grabbed our almost dead flashlights and went out into the forest, yelling Greg's name at the top of our lungs. Those giant cliffs in the park just loomed over us, all dark and menacing. My boots were squelching in the mud with every step, and the cold rain was running down my neck. It was miserable. Sarah kept tripping over roots and rocks, and Lisa was pale as a ghost, tears streaming down her face, but she kept pushing on, determined to find Greg. Eventually, we spotted this faint, flickering light near one of the cliff edges. It was Greg's flashlight, just lying there on the ground, shining up at this smear of blood on the rocks. My stomach dropped out. There was no sign of him. We searched the whole area, calling his name until our voices were hoarse, but the wind just swallowed up our shouts. Then that same mournful wail echoed again, way closer this time, and Lisa nearly collapsed in my arms. We stumbled back to the cabin, soaked to the bone and half crazed with fear. Sarah's teeth were chattering so hard I thought they'd break, and Lisa couldn't stop sobbing. The storm raged all night, and every time lightning flashed, it looked like there was this figure standing outside, but then it would vanish as soon as the darkness came back. At one point, Sarah gasped and swore she saw a woman with hollow eyes staring in through the window. I tried to calm her down, but honestly, I was starting to feel this dread, like something heavy was pressing down on me. By dawn, we were running on pure adrenaline, no sleep, just raw nerves. Lisa was still clinging to the hope that Greg might be alive, even after seeing the blood. Sarah confessed to me that she'd started hearing voices too, these faint whispers that kept repeating her name in the wind. Part of me just wanted to pack up and get the hell out of there, but the roads were a muddy mess, and we were missing a car key. Mine had vanished from the kitchen counter, just like Sarah's necklace. Desperate, we decided to try and find a ranger station, or some kind of park official's cabin, anything to call for help. We left the main road, cutting through the woods, and just trudged for hours. The whole forest felt like it was against us, like it wanted us gone. The deeper we went, the colder it got, until finally, we stumbled upon this old ranger station. The roof was sagging, and the windows were all boarded up from the inside, but it was better than nothing. We pried the door open and stepped inside. It was dark and dusty, with cobwebs hanging from the rafters, and the whole place smelled like mildew and decay. Hello. I called out, even though I didn't really expect anyone to answer. Then, to our total shock, Greg stepped out from behind a beat-up old desk. He was alive, but he looked different. There was this wild glint in his eyes. He was covered in mud, breathing hard, and clutching his arm, which was all scratched and bleeding. Lisa ran to him sobbing, but he flinched away from her touch like she was a hot stove. "Greg, thank God," I said, rushing over to him. "Are you okay? What happened?" He just stared at me, then at Sarah, then back at Lisa. His pupils were huge, like he was in shock or something. For a long moment, nobody said anything. Finally he croaked out, "It wants Sarah." His voice was hoarse, almost unrecognizable. I glanced at Sarah, whose face had gone completely white. "Greg, what are you talking about?" she asked, her voice trembling. He shook his head, taking a step back. "I tried to keep it away," he mumbled. "I tried." Suddenly, he shoved this heavy shelf in front of the door, the wood scraping against the floor, making this awful screeching sound. He fumbled with the lock, locking it from the inside. My heart was hammering in my chest. "Greg, what the hell are you doing?" I shouted, rushing towards him, but he raised the flashlight, his only weapon, and swung it at my head. I stumbled back to avoid getting hit. "The Banshee, it's real," he hissed, his eyes wide and frantic. "It spoke to me, showed me things. It wants Sarah. If we give her to it, maybe the rest of us can survive." Lisa screamed at him. "You're out of your mind. We are not giving anyone to that thing." She tried to grab his arm, but he shoved her away, almost knocking her to the floor. I lunged at him, wrestling him for the flashlight. Rain was drumming on the roof, and thunder was booming like crazy overhead. Sarah tried to help, but Greg twisted around, and I accidentally knocked into her. She went sprawling across the dusty floor, coughing. I managed to pin Greg's arms for a second, but the guy was strong, fueled by some kind of insane terror. His eyes were wild, tears mixing with sweat and mud on his cheeks. He looked like he was possessed by something beyond fear. In his madness, he bit down on my hand, so hard that I yelped in pain and let go on instinct. He scrambled up and threw open an interior door. It led to this cramped storage room, lined with old gear and junk. He shoved Sarah inside and slammed the door shut. I heard her scream and start pounding on the door, desperate to get out. Lisa rushed forward to help Sarah, only to catch an elbow in the ribs from Greg. She doubled over, gasping for air. I was beyond furious now. I tackled him again, forcing him to the ground. We grappled, rolling over broken crates and rusted chairs. Then, suddenly, the Banshee's wail erupted outside, right outside the station. It was so loud that it felt like it was inside my head, vibrating through my bones. The sound was so intense that my vision blurred, like the noise alone was trying to crack my skull. Greg screeched in pain, covering his ears. I saw my chance and smashed the flashlight out of his hand. It clattered to the floor, the light flickering wildly. Lisa, tears of rage in her eyes, crawled over to the storage room door and wrenched it open. Sarah stumbled out, clutching her shoulder, looking dazed. The moment they were together, the windows of the station rattled. And then we saw it. On the other side of the glass, this thing appeared. It had pale features, hair like silver threads, and eyes that were just black, endless pits. It looked like a woman, but not quite. Its mouth was stretched open in a silent wail, and just looking at it made my blood run cold. Greg was on his knees, staring at the figure, his face twisted with terror. "You said you'd let me live," he cried out, like he was actually talking to the Banshee. Then, the window shattered inwards, glass spraying all over the floor. The station door started rattling, like something heavy was slamming against it. I could barely think over the noise. I grabbed Sarah's hand. "We have to go," I yelled. I saw the exit was blocked by the shelf, and I dashed over, trying to push it out of the way. Lisa joined me, her face set with grim determination. Together, we strained against the wood, my muscles burning as the Banshee's scream intensified. Greg scrambled to his feet, a crazed look in his eyes. He still thought he could reason with the creature. He was completely gone. Finally, with a loud scrape, the shelf moved, and we tumbled out into the pouring rain. The sky was dark and swirling, and lightning forked overhead, momentarily illuminating the Banshee. It was floating just outside the door, its mouth still open in that soundless cry that seemed to pierce right through us. Greg tried to follow us, babbling about sacrifices, but a sudden gust of wind slammed the door shut on him. I caught a glimpse of him through the broken window, being dragged back inside by some unseen force, his fingernails raking across the floor in desperation. Then I heard one final, piercing shriek, and then silence. He was gone. The three of us, Sarah, Lisa, and I, just ran. We ran through the storm, the wind whipping the trees into a frenzy. Every flash of lightning revealed glimpses of the Banshee gliding behind us, like it was toying with us. Sarah was gasping in pain with every step, like the creature's presence was crushing her soul. I stumbled over roots, nearly losing my balance, my heart pounding so hard I thought it would burst out of my chest. Finally, we made it back to the muddy road leading to the cabin. Our SUV was still there, right where we'd left it, but I still couldn't find my damn key. In a fit of pure frustration and desperation, I yanked on the handle anyway, hoping, praying it was unlocked. It was. But the ignition was useless without a key, of course. Sarah collapsed into the passenger seat, shivering uncontrollably, while Lisa and I frantically searched under the mats, in the glove compartment, everywhere. That's when Lisa let out a startled cry. She opened her fist, and there it was, her engagement ring. She must have grabbed it at some point, but the band was twisted, blackened, like it had been scorched. I remembered how we'd found it in the ashes earlier. It's cursed, she whispered, her voice trembling. I can feel it. It's tied to that thing. Greg proposed to me out here. He did it while mocking the old stories, the local legends. He bragged that we could make our own luck. She looked up at me, her eyes wide with a terrible realization. Maybe that's how it got summoned. Maybe it latched onto his arrogance. I didn't know what to say. The wind was howling, shaking the SUV, and in the flashes of lightning, I could see the Banshee floating there behind a thin veil of rain, its hollow eyes fixed on Sarah. Sarah was holding her head, like she was in agony. Dave, it's calling my name, she whispered. I can hear it, it's in my head. Lisa, her voice trembling but resolute, said, I have to draw it away from her. She turned the ring in her hand. If I can get it away from Sarah, maybe we can break its hold. Before I could even process what she was saying, before I could stop her, Lisa lunged from the SUV and sprinted out into the storm. The Banshee turned its gaze on Lisa, letting out a howl so piercing I felt my consciousness flicker. Sarah screamed, Lisa, no. But Lisa kept running, practically daring the thing to follow her. And it did. The white figure shifted instantly, disappearing into the darkness after her. I tried to start the SUV again, a futile effort. Tears were mixing with the rain on my face. We can't leave her, Sarah sobbed, reaching for the door handle, but a sudden, violent gust of wind forced the door shut. We were trapped. Then, from the forest, we heard one last scream, a horrifying mix of Lisa's voice and the Banshee's wail, a sound I'll never, ever forget. And then, silence. Absolute, crushing silence, broken only by the patter of rain on the roof. The Banshee was gone. And so was Lisa. I climbed into the driver's seat, practically hyperventilating. Sarah, we have to get out of here. Now! She just nodded, numb with shock and grief. We scrambled out of the SUV and took off down the muddy road on foot, holding each other up as exhaustion threatened to overwhelm us. The storm began to ease, as though whatever had been fueling it was fading away. After what felt like an eternity of stumbling over roots and slipping in the mud, we saw headlights. A park ranger's truck emerged from the darkness. Two rangers jumped out, shining flashlights on us, yelling for us to stop. Relief flooded through me, so intense I nearly collapsed into one of the rangers' arms. They took us to a ranger station that was actually staffed, a place with electricity and radios. We tried to explain what happened, but we sounded like lunatics. I know we did. They organized a search party for Greg and Lisa. The official report would say that a severe storm and flash flooding were the likely culprits for their disappearance. They never found any definitive sign of them, or of any woman in white. Days later, Sarah and I were released from the hospital. Physically, we were mostly fine, just some cuts, bruises, and borderline hypothermia. Mentally, we were shattered. When I finally got the courage to go back for my SUV, it was still parked on that lonely road. The inside was coated with dried mud. And there, on the driver's seat, was my missing key, even though I could have sworn I'd searched there a dozen times. They never found Greg or Lisa. Officially, they're both missing, though I know the truth is far darker. The rangers chalked up our story to severe stress and the storm. Sometimes I wish that's all it was. Now I'm back in Chicago, trying to rebuild some kind of normal life. Sarah and I hardly talk about the trip. She wakes up screaming sometimes, insisting she can hear the Banshee calling her from the walls. And sometimes when she's standing in front of a mirror, I see her reflection flicker. Just a trick of the light, I tell myself, but deep down, I know better. Even in our modern world, there are forces out there we can't understand, cruel, ancient powers drawn to arrogance and fear. I still dream about that night, about the window shattering, about Greg's eyes filled with desperation, and about Lisa's final run into the storm with that cursed ring. And when the wind howls past my apartment window, I catch myself thinking I hear that same unearthly wail. And every time, my heart races with the memory of Giant City State Park. I'll never go back there. Some things are best left behind, but no matter how far I run, I can't shake the certainty that the banshee is still out there, perhaps whispering my name on the wind, biding its time. My name's Chloe Evans, and I'm 29, or I will be in a couple weeks. This all went down last fall, October 2024. We'd planned this camping trip to Kanaka River State Park in Illinois, me and my crew. We were all dying for a break from our insane lives. You know, the sun was already starting to set, making everything all golden and red. As our beat-up SUV bounced along that bumpy gravel road to the park, I glanced in the rearview mirror at my friends, feeling that excited but kinda nervous buzz. We'd been talking about this trip for months. A whole weekend away from work crap, and the never-ending noise of the city. Almost there, I said, trying to sound all chill, even though my stomach was doing flip-flops. Next to me in the passenger seat was Liam, my boyfriend. He had his camera bag practically glued to his lap. He gave me this little smile, but I could see the same kind of anticipation in his eyes. He's a photographer, always chasing the perfect shot. Behind us, Maya and No were chattering away like a couple of magpies, their voices mixing with the rumble of the engine. Maya's a total firecracker, and No, well, he's the level-headed one of the group. A good mix, you know. Kanaka River State Park is supposed to be all epic forests and a chill river. We'd picked a spot way deep in, far from the main trails. We were all about that total privacy, you know, getting lost in nature, the whole deal. As we finally pulled into our campsite, I took this huge breath of that crisp, fall air. The trees were insane, like seriously on fire with color reds, yellows, oranges. It was picture perfect, straight out of some autumn lover's Instagram feed. Okay, team, let's get this show on the road, I called out, hopping out of the car. I'm usually the one taking charge. Liam was right behind me, already fiddling with his camera gear. Maya and No started unloading their backpacks. We'd rented this tent, and honestly, it looked a bit janky. Doesn't this tent look kind of old? Maya said, giving it the side eye. Trust Maya to spot a problem a mile away. It'll be fine, I said, trying to sound more confident than I felt. We're here to enjoy the great outdoors, not to, inspect every scene. Noah laughed. Always the easygoing one. Besides, Chloe always picks the best spots. If anything, a dodgy tent just adds to the adventure, right? So, we spent the next hour setting up camp. I was organizing the gear, trying to make sure everything was where it should be. Liam was, of course, obsessing over his camera equipment, making sure each lens was pristine. Maya was setting up the portable stove. She's the queen of camp cooking. And No took charge of the firewood, because, well, he's the muscle. We fell into this easy rhythm, the kind you only get with friends you've known forever. As the last bit of daylight faded, we were all sitting around the campfire. The flames were casting these flickering shadows on our faces, making everyone look all mysterious. The conversation was flowing, stories and jokes and just good vibes. The sounds of the forest, crickets chirping, leaves rustling. It was all so peaceful. This is exactly what we needed, Liam said, his eyes reflecting the firelight. Just us. Away from everything. I nodded, feeling this warm sense of accomplishment. Like, yeah, I did good. Totally. I agreed. Let's make the most of it. It felt like we were finally going to have a weekend to just breathe. Reconnect with our real selves before Monday came. This was the trip we had to have. After we'd stuffed ourselves with s'mores and campfire, cooked grub, we decided to take a little hike on one of the nearby trails. It was a narrow path, all twisty and winding through these dense woods. The air got cooler as we walked, and the sounds of the forest, the crickets and stuff, they seemed to get louder, like someone turned up the volume on nature. This is beautiful, Noah said, always the appreciative one. He stopped to take a picture of this one tree, a maple, I think, that was just blazing with red leaves. I love how the light filters through the leaves, all dappled and stuff. Maya, being Maya, was more focused on the practical. Let's stick to the path, guys, she said, her voice a little tense. We don't want to get lost out here. I smiled, because that's just who she is, always thinking ahead. Don't worry, Maya, I reassured her. We're all together. But as we went deeper into the woods, the trees seemed to get thicker, taller. The shadows they cast were getting longer, dancing in the fading light like, I don't know, spooky puppets. The trail became less obvious, too. It was all uneven ground and fallen branches. Maybe we should head back, Maya suggested after a while. It was getting darker, and I had to admit, the trail was way harder to follow than I thought it would be. I looked around. The last bits of sunlight were disappearing fast. Yeah, you're right, I said. Let's head back to camp. We turned around, retracing our steps, but something felt off. It was like the forest had changed somehow. The shadows seemed longer, deeper. The trees seemed closer together, like they were crowding us, trying to swallow us whole. Guys, I think we took a wrong turn, Liam said, and I could hear the unease in his voice. This doesn't look familiar. I stopped, trying to keep my breathing steady. My heart, though, that was another story. It was doing a drum solo in my chest. Don't panic, I said, trying to sound like the leader I was supposed to be. Let's just try to find something we recognize, a landmark or something. No pulled out his phone, but of course no signal. Great, he muttered. No GPS to save us. Maya, ever cautious, scanned the area. We should stick together, she said firmly. Splitting up will only make things worse. So we kept walking, but the forest just seemed to get darker and darker. And the sounds, they were getting weirder too. Every rustle, every snap, it sent a shiver down my spine. Like we were being watched. We need to find the campsite, I urged, trying to keep everyone's spirits up. Even mine, if I'm being honest. It's just ahead. We can make it. But the trail seemed to go on forever. We just couldn't seem to reach that clearing where our camp was. It was like the forest was playing tricks on us. Then I saw something that made my blood run cold. There were these weird symbols carved into the trees. Intricate, twisted designs that just looked wrong. Have you guys seen these before? I asked, pointing at the markings. Liam, ever the photographer, leaned in close, his eyes tracing the lines. No, never, he said, his voice low. They look like, I don't know, some kind of warning, or a curse, maybe. Maya frowned. her logical brain trying to make sense of it. Maybe someone else camped here before us, she suggested. Kund left these as markers. No, always on guard now, kept his eyes on the darkness around us. Whatever they are, let's not mess with them, he said. We just need to get back. Night fell completely, and it got cold, like bone-chilling cold. The sounds of the forest were even more menacing now. We decided to just power through, using our phone flashlights to guide us. Over here, I called out, spotting what I thought was a familiar clearing. Relief washed over me, but it was short-lived. As we got closer, I realized something was seriously wrong. Our campsite was trashed. The tent lines were torn, our stuff was scattered everywhere, and the fire was just cold ashes. What happened here? Lime exclaimed, stepping into the destroyed campsite. Maya knelt down, examining the ground, her mind racing. It looks like someone, or something was here, she said, her voice tight with fear. And these symbols, they're everywhere. Noah stood protectively in front of us, his eyes darting around, scanning the darkness. We need to check the perimeter, he said, his voice low and urgent. Make sure whatever did this isn't still around. We split up, moving cautiously around the campsite. My heart was pounding so hard, I thought it was going to burst out of my chest. I was desperately searching for any clue, anything that could explain what had happened. Liam was checking his camera gear, his usual calm replaced by this tense, worried energy. Maya was examining the symbols, her skepticism wavering in the face of something she clearly couldn't explain. Suddenly, a loud chirace echoed from the woods, followed by these whispers, like a whole bunch of voices all around us, but we couldn't understand what they were saying. My skin prickled with fear. The forest felt alive, and not in a good way. It felt like something was watching us, hunting us. Did you hear that? I whispered, my voice barely audible. Before anyone could answer, this shadowy figure emerged from the darkness. It was cloaked in these tattered robes that seemed to just suck all the light out of the air. Just being near it felt suffocating, like the air was getting thick and hard to breathe. Who's there? No demanded, stepping forward, all brave and protective. The figure didn't answer. It just stared at us with these, I don't even know if you could call them eyes. Just dark pits where eyes should be, and the whispers. They got louder, swirling around us like some kind of evil, whispering tornado. We need to leave, Maya urged, her voice shaking. Now, this isn't natural. But when we turned to run, the forest seemed to shift again. The path we thought we were on, gone, twisted into something else. Something unfamiliar. Panic set in. We were trapped, lost in the middle of nowhere, with something dark and ancient hunting us. Stay together, I commanded, trying to keep my voice from cracking. We can find a way out. We have to. We were so close to the edge of something terrible. I could feel it. We stumbled through the underbrush, thorns and branches snagging at our clothes and skin. The symbols on the trees seemed to writhe and twist, like they were reaching out for us, trying to grab us. The air was heavy, suffocating, like we were trying to breathe underwater. And everywhere we looked, there were eyes. Not real eyes, but the feeling of being watched, judged. It was crushing. Liam tripped over a root, falling hard and dropping his camera with a sickening thud. He struggled to get up, and that's when I saw it, a new symbol carved into a nearby tree. This one was different, more sinister. It looked like that shadowy figure we'd seen. the one that seemed to be made of nightmares. We need to move faster, Noah urged, pulling Liam to his feet. Whatever this is, it's not going to let us go easily. Maya, ever the voice of reason, even when things were totally insane, suggested. Maybe we should try to retrace our steps from the campsite. There has to be a way back. We tried, we really did, but the forest seemed to mock our efforts. The path kept changing, leading us deeper and deeper into the darkness. We were exhausted, terrified, and losing hope fast. Each of us was battling our own fear, trying to keep it together for the others. Guys, look. Liam suddenly pointed to a faint light flickering through the trees ahead. Maybe someone else is here, or a ranger station. Hope, that tiny flickering ember, flared up inside me. We picked up our pace, the possibility of rescue driving us forward. But as we got closer, the light revealed itself to be another campsite. Just like ours, only it was abandoned and eerily silent. This is creepy, No muttered, looking around nervously. Why would someone set up camp here, and then just leave like that? Before anyone could answer, that shadowy figure reappeared, this time closer, even more menacing. And the whispers, they intensified, now forming words that chilled me to the bone. You do not belong here. A sudden gust of wind extinguished our phone flashlights, plunging us into complete darkness. Panic erupted. We fumbled to turn them back on, but the lights seemed to struggle against the darkness, like it was some kind of living entity, swallowing the light. Run, I screamed, grabbing Maya's hand. We sprinted away from the cursed campsite, the others right behind us. Our footsteps echoed in the oppressive silence, a frantic rhythm against the backdrop of the whispering woods. As we fled, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being hunted, chased by something we couldn't see, couldn't understand. The forest felt alive with a malevolent intent, every shadow a potential threat. Why is this happening to us? Liam gasped, his breath coming in ragged bursts. We just wanted a simple camping trip. We needed a break. Maya's logical mind was racing, trying to find answers in a situation that defied all logic. There has to be something here, she said. Some kind of curse or legend. We need to understand what we're dealing with. But there was no time for research, no time for understanding. Only the desperate need to survive. The whispers followed us, a constant, chilling reminder of the danger lurking just beyond our sight. We stumbled upon a small clearing. Moonlight filtered through the trees, casting an eerie glow on the scene before us. In the center stood an ancient stone altar, covered in those same sinister symbols that had plagued our journey. What is this place? Noah whispered, his voice trembling. Before anyone could answer, the ground beneath us began to shake. Cracks formed in the earth, and a cold, dark mist started to seep out, enveloping the clearing. And then, the shadowy figure materialized once more, now towering over us, more terrifying than ever. You cannot escape. It intoned, the voice echoing in our minds, a chorus of dread. Your souls are mine. Fear, raw and primal, gripped me. I finally understood. This wasn't just about being lost in the woods. This was something far more ancient, far more evil. We were trapped in some kind of dark ritual, caught in a web spun by a malevolent force that fed on fear and desperation. We need to stay calm, I urged, trying to take control, even though my insides were screaming. There has to be a way out of this. There has to be. But as the mist closed in, I felt an overwhelming sense of dread, The forest around us seemed to press in, the trees whispering dark secrets I didn't want to hear. Our survival now depended on figuring out this twisted puzzle, on confronting whatever dark entity was trying to claim us. It wasn't just about escaping the woods anymore. It was about escaping with our souls intact. The freezing mist swirled around us, chilling me to the bone. That shadowy figure loomed larger, its presence crushing, suffocating. My mind raced, grasping at straws, trying to remember anything, any local legend or folklore that might give us a clue. Then, like a bolt of lightning, a name flashed through my memory from some research I found earlier. Research Lily did. Morana, I whispered, the name tasting like ash in my mouth. The swamp hag, a malevolent spirit bound to these woods. We have to do something, I said, my voice trembling with desperation. We can't just stand here and let it take us. Liam, despite the terror in his eyes, was nodding, always looking for a way to do something. There must be a way to break the curse, Maya said, ever the pragmatist, even in the face of utter horror. She pulled out her phone, even though there was no signal. Maybe there was something, anything, we could use from what we'd learned before we got here. Morana was wronged, she continued, her voice tight. Maybe we can appease her. Noah glanced around, his protective instincts on high alert. What do we know about her? He asked. Any rituals, offerings, anything that might help? I took a deep breath, stepping forward, addressing the ancient altar as if it were a living thing. We need to understand her story, I said, my voice echoing in the stillness of the clearing. What happened to her? Maya stepped beside me, her fingers tracing the sinister symbols carved into the stone. According to these old journals we found earlier, she said, her voice hushed. Morana was once a healer in this area. She was betrayed by the locals, blamed for some terrible events, maybe a plague or something. They said it was dark magic. Her grief and anger, it twisted into this curse, trapping her spirit here, turning the forest against anyone who enters. Liam, still reeling from the whole terrifying experience, chimed in weakly. So, if we honor her memory, or make amends, maybe she'll let us go. Noah frowned, looking at the ominous figure that still loomed over us. But how? He asked. We don't even know what to do. Maya was frantically flipping through her notes on her phone, her analytical mind working overtime. There's a passage here, she said, about a ritual of appeasement. It involves creating a circle of offerings, items that symbolize peace and respect. Maybe if we can gather some from the forest, it might work. I looked around. The moonlight barely pierced the dense canopy. It was a long shot, but it was all we had. We need to gather what we can, I said. Jess, you, Liam and Maya collect the offerings. No, you stay here and try to keep that thing from getting any closer. Try to protect the perimeter. Noah hesitated, glancing at the shadowy figure, which seemed to pulse with dark energy. Are you sure? He asked. What if it targets you while you're gone? We don't have a choice, I said firmly. This might be our only chance to survive. Reluctantly, Noah nodded and took up a defensive stance, his eyes never leaving the shadowy figure. Liam, Maya, and I moved cautiously through the forest. The oppressive atmosphere made each step feel like wading through molasses. The symbols on the trees seemed to guide us, leading us deeper into the heart of Morana's domain. After what felt like an eternity, We reached a small clearing bathed in the faint glow of bioluminescent fungi. It was strangely beautiful, in a haunting sort of way. "This is it," Liam whispered, his voice tinged with awe and fear. "It's like a sacred place." Maya began gathering items, smooth stones, wild flowers, and herbs native to the area. "We need to create a circle here," she instructed. "These items represent peace and respect for the land." I placed the stones in a perfect circle, trying to make it as symmetrical as possible. Maya arranged the flowers and herbs inside, her hands surprisingly steady despite the fear that I knew she was feeling. Liam, still a bit shaky, placed a personal item into the center, his camera. A token of our presence, our intent. "We need to focus our intentions," I instructed, stepping back to observe our work. "We're here to honor Marana and ask for her forgiveness." But we held hands, forming a circle around the offerings, a silent bond of unity and hope. "We mean no harm," I spoke softly, my voice echoing in the stillness. "Do we respect you and the land? Please, let us leave in peace." For a moment, nothing happened. The forest remained silent, the mist swirling gently around us. But then, the ground beneath us began to vibrate, and a low hum filled the air. The shadowy figure reappeared, but this time it seemed different, less menacing, almost sorrowful. A soft glow emanated from the altar, and the symbols began to shimmer with an ethereal light. The oppressive mist dissipated, replaced by a gentle breeze that carried the scent of blooming flowers. Marana's presence seemed to soften, her form becoming less defined, more like a spirit bound to the earth. "We did it," Liam breathed, relief washing over him. But the moment was shattered by a blood-curdling scream. A piercing wail echoed through the woods, and the ground trembled violently. The symbols on the altar darkened, the light flickering ominously. "No," Maya gasped, her eyes wide with fear. "Something's wrong." The shadowy figure emerged, now accompanied by several other apparitions, ghostly figures of former victims, trapped by Marana's curse. They swirled around us, their eyes hollow and filled with anguish. The oppressive energy returned, stronger than before. "Leave this place." Marana's voice echoed in our minds, a mix of sorrow and rage. "Your souls are mine." Panic surged through me. Our ritual hadn't appeased Marana, it had injured her. The apparitions began to close in, their spectral hands reaching out, trying to pull us into the darkness. "We need to run," I shouted, grabbing Maya and Lem's hands. We bolted from the clearing, the forest seeming to come alive around us. Trees bent and twisted to block our path, branches snapping like whips against our skin. Behind us, we heard No yell. He'd been fending off the apparitions, his protective instincts driving him to shield us. But there were too many. A ghostly hand reached out, striking him down. We saw him fall, his body convulsing as he was dragged into the spectral embrace. "No," I screamed, turning back, but Liam pulled me forward. "We can't help him now," he yelled, his voice filled with grief and terror. "We have to go." Tears streamed down Maya's face as we continued to run, the forest seeming to stretch endlessly before us. Liam, still holding onto his camera for dear life, stumbled beside me, his breaths coming in ragged gasps. "We have to find another way," Maya cried, her voice breaking. "We can't let this be our end." We stumbled through the dense underbrush, guided by sheer instinct and the faint hope of escaping Marana's curse. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of twigs, heightened our fear. The apparitions were never far behind. After what felt like an eternity, we emerged into a small valley, illuminated by the first light of dawn. Exhausted, battered, and heartbroken, we collapsed onto the forest floor, our bodies aching from the relentless pursuit. Made it, Liam panted, his eyes glassy with exhaustion. We're out. But our relief was short-lived. In the distance, we could see the remnants of the altar, now a smoldering ruin. The symbols were no longer visible, but the oppressive energy lingered, a dark reminder of our ordeal. "We need to leave this place," I said, struggling to my feet. "No." We dragged ourselves toward the edge of the valley, the forest behind us whispering with unseen voices. As we reached the boundary, a final apparition materialized, standing tall and sorrowful. "You may have escaped," Marana's voice echoed one last time, "but the curse remains. The forest will claim those who trespass again." With that, the apparition faded, and the forest fell silent. We didn't look back. Our footsteps quickened as we made our way to safety. The drive back to civilization was a blur, the memory of the haunted woods seared into our minds. Hours later, we arrived at the ranger station, our clothes torn, our faces pale with fear. The rangers took our stories with a mix of skepticism and concern, but we knew the truth of what had transpired. Days passed, and the trauma of that night weighed heavily on us. Noah was never found, his disappearance leaving a void that could never be filled. Liam struggled with guilt, haunted by the images of his friend's suffering and his own near-death experience. Maya, ever the skeptic, found herself questioning everything she thought she knew about the world. As for me, I couldn't shake the feeling that Marana's curse still lingered, a dark presence watching from the shadows. The memories of that night in Kanaka River State Park remained vivid, a constant reminder of the thin line between reality and the supernatural. One evening, months later, I found myself back at the edge of the forest, unable to resist the pull of the haunted woods. The scars of that night had left me searching for answers, hoping to find some closure, some understanding. As I stood there, the wind whispered through the trees, carrying with it the faint echo of Marana's sorrowful lament. I realized that some places hold secrets too dark to uncover, and some curses are meant to remain unbroken. With a heavy heart, I turned away, leaving the witching woods behind. But deep down, I knew that the forest malevolent spirit would forever be a part of me. A reminder of the night's survival and friendship were tested by the forces of darkness, and the price we paid for a weekend getaway we'd never forget. My name is Sarah Jenkins, and I'm 35 years old. This whole nightmare started in the middle of nowhere, a place called Midwin National Tallgrass Prairie in Illinois. I thought it'd be the perfect escape, the solitude I was craving. I'd always found peace in nature, but lately, the city life had just been grinding me down. My writing was totally stalled, like my creative well had run completely dry, and to top it all off, my recent breakup just left me feeling lost. So, when my boyfriend, Alex, suggested a week-long camping trip to Midwin with my best friend, Emily, I jumped at the chance. I figured it was exactly what I needed to unplug, clear my head, and hopefully find some inspiration again. Alex Mitchell, my boyfriend of 5 years, was a total outdoorsy type. He was 38, super confident, always knew what to do in any situation, and was always up for an adventure. He was really into photography, which was cool because it usually meant we'd end up in some pretty awesome, remote locations. Emily Parker, my best friend since college, was also a photographer. She was 34, outgoing, always saw the good in people, and just as adventurous as me. I always admired her ability to capture the wild beauty around us. We rolled up to the prairie on a crisp Friday morning. Picture this grasslands stretching as far as the eye could see, with just a few clumps of trees here and there and some old, beat-up barns in the distance. The air was so fresh. It smelled like wildflowers and earth. We set up camp near a small grove of oak trees, and right away, I felt that sense of calm that only nature can give you. Alex was quick to get the tents up. He was like a pro, always so efficient with that stuff. Emily was already scoping out the best spots for photos, her camera lens glinting in the sunlight. I found a quiet spot to set up my little writing area, just a journal and a pen, hoping the peace and quiet would get my creative juices flowing again. By the time evening rolled around, the sun was starting to set, painting the sky all these crazy shades of orange and pink. We gathered around the campfire, flames flickering and casting long shadows on our faces. At first, the conversation was easy, just chatting about past adventures and what we wanted to do that week. But as the night went on, we started getting into deeper stuff. Alex talked about his latest photography project. Emily shared her dream of publishing a photo book someday, and I, kinda hesitantly, opened up about my writer's block and how messed up I still was about the breakup. As the fire died down, the sounds of the prairie seemed to get louder, the rustling of the grass, the distant calls of who knows what animals, and the wind whispering through the trees. I felt this wave of calm wash over me, the kind you only get when you're truly alone, but still surrounded by life. The first day was pretty uneventful, but by the second morning, things started to feel a little off. We woke up to a light drizzle, the rain tapping softly on our tents. Alex, Emily, and I huddled inside, sharing a breakfast of instant oatmeal. "Looks like we're gonna have to change our plans," Alex said, glancing at his GPS, which was acting wonky. "This thing's on the fritz. We might not have accurate coordinates for some of the trails." I frowned, checking my own gear. "Our tents aren't as waterproof as we thought," I pointed out. "We might have some leaks if it keeps raining." Emily, ever the optimist, tried to lighten the mood. "At least it's giving us some extra time to explore," she said. "These weather patterns can be unpredictable out here." As the day went on, the initial excitement of our trip started to give way to the realities of, well, roughing it. We decided to stick close to camp, only going out when we had to. Alex was determined to get the perfect sunrise shot, while Emily wanted to explore a nearby grove of trees that she'd heard had amazing light for photography. I just focused on my writing, hoping that eventually the tranquility would break through my creative block. By late afternoon, you could feel the tension starting to build. Alex and Emily had different ideas about how to spend the rest of the day. Alex wanted to stick to a specific trail known for its scenic views, while Emily was all about wandering off trail to find unique photo ops. "Emily, we can't afford to stray too far," Alex argued, his frustration pretty obvious. "The GPS is unreliable, and we need to stay within range of our supplies." Emily shot back. "Sometimes the best shots are found off the beaten path. We won't be long, and it could be worth it." I watched them bicker, feeling the strain of our different priorities. Maybe we can find a compromise, I suggested. Alex, you can take the trail, and Emily can explore that grove. We'll meet back at the campsite by dusk. Alex nodded reluctantly, and Emily agreed, though her eyes still held that spark of defiance. As the sun started to set, casting long shadows across the prairie, we all went off to do our own thing. I stayed behind, jotting down notes and observations, trying to make sense of the subtle shifts I was starting to feel in the environment around us. That night, the sky was clear, revealing a tapestry of stars. The campfire crackled, and we shared a quiet meal. The earlier tension was still there, but it was kind of masked by the shared experience of being under that vast, open sky. But as the night wore on, this uneasy feeling settled over me. It started with small things. One of the photos Emily showed me the next morning had this weird shadow in the background, something I didn't remember seeing there. "Did you notice that in this shot?" I asked, pointing to the blurry shape lurking near the trees. Emily frowned, taking the photo from my hand. I don't see anything unusual. Maybe it's just a trick of the light." Alex joined us, glancing at the photo. "Probably just a branch or something," he said. "These old prairies can create some weird shadows." But that seed of doubt had been planted. Over the next few days, more unsettling things started happening. Our stuff would disappear, only to reappear in the strangest places. My journal, filled with all my thoughts and sketches, was found tucked under a rock near the trail. Alex's camera lenses went missing, and we found them scattered in the grass, all scratched up and foggy. One evening, I was sitting by the fire, trying to write, when I heard footsteps approaching. I looked up, but saw no one. "Alex, Emily," I called out, but only silence answered me. The firelight flickered, casting these dancing shadows that seemed to move on their own. "Probably just an animal," Alex said, coming back to join me, but even his presence didn't really ease my anxiety. The prairie felt different now, more alive, almost like it was watching us. That night, the whispers started. At first, they were faint, barely audible over the sounds of the prairie. But as I lay in my tent, trying to sleep, the whispers grew louder, forming these indistinct words that sent shivers down my spine. I pulled the blanket tighter around me, heart pounding, trying to rationalize what I was hearing. It had to be the wind, right? The next day, Emily was super eager to go back to that grove of trees for better shots. Even though Alex was still hesitant, she managed to convince him to go with her, leaving me to stay behind. I spent the day writing, trying to ignore the growing tension between them, and this eerie feeling that something was watching us. As dusk approached, I heard Emily calling out from the grove, "Sarah, you should come see this. The light here is perfect." I hesitated, glancing at Alex. "I think we should stick to the plan, Emily," I called back. "It's getting late, and we need to be cautious." She sighed, frustration clear in her voice. "Fine, but I really think you're missing out on something amazing here." Alex nodded, though his eyes seemed distant. "Let's make sure we all get back before dark," he said. "Safety first." As night fell, the prairie totally transformed. The open sky was now this canopy of stars, and the grasslands were shrouded in darkness. The sounds of nocturnal creatures filled the air, but there was this underlying stillness that felt really unnatural. I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. Every rustle of grass, every distant call, seemed amplified in the still night. I decided to take a short walk to clear my head, hoping the fresh air would help. As I wandered a few feet from the campsite, the whispers returned, louder and more distinct this time. "Leave now," they seemed to say, carried by the wind. I turned abruptly, my eyes scanning the darkness, but I saw nothing. My heart was racing as I hurried back to camp, the oppressive silence weighing on me. Back at camp, Alex and Emily were already asleep, the tension of the day evident in their quiet breaths. I tried to settle into my tent, but sleep was impossible. The whispers continued, now intertwined with the sounds of the prairie. Shadows seemed to move at the edge of my vision, and the once peaceful night now felt like a living nightmare. The following morning brought no relief. Emily was still itching to explore, her enthusiasm undeterred by the previous night's events. "Come on, Sarah," she urged. "I found something incredible last night. You have to see it." I sighed, knowing that arguing with her would just cause more tension. "All right, but we need to be careful," I said. "The GPS is still acting up, and we don't know what's out there." We set out together, the vast prairie stretching endlessly around us. The sun was high, casting strong shadows that seemed to dance with every step we took. Emily led the way, her camera capturing every moment, while Alex trailed slightly behind, his eyes scanning the horizon for the perfect shot. After an hour of walking, we stumbled upon this old, abandoned cabin hidden among the tall grasses. The structure was totally weathered, its wooden planks worn and partially collapsed. Vines crept up the sides, and the roof sagged under the weight of time. Emily's eyes lit up with excitement. "This is perfect," she exclaimed, rushing towards the cabin. "Imagine the photos we can get here." Alex followed, though his hesitation was clear. "Be careful, Emily," he warned. "We don't know how stable that place is." Inside the cabin, the air was thick with the scent of decay. Sunlight streamed through the broken windows, illuminating dust particles that floated in the stagnant air. We explored the space cautiously, finding remnants of past inhabitants, old furniture, broken tools, and faded photographs scattered across the floor. Emily was captivated, snapping photos of everything she could. "This is incredible," she said. "It's like stepping back in time." As we ventured deeper, I noticed something odd, a series of symbols etched into the wooden beams. They were intricate, almost ritualistic, and they sent a chill down my spine. "Do you guys see this?" I asked, pointing to the markings. Alex examined them closely. "These look like some kind of protective symbols," he said. "Maybe the previous occupants were trying to ward off something." Emily shook her head, her focus still on capturing the perfect shot. "Or maybe they were part of something more sinister," she said. "This place gives me the creeps." I couldn't shake the feeling that we were trespassing on something sacred, or maybe even cursed. The prairie held a lot of secrets, and this cabin was just one of them. As we left the cabin, the afternoon sun was starting to dip, casting long, eerie shadows across the prairie. The whispers had returned, louder and more insistent this time. "Leave now," they echoed, carried by the wind. I glanced at Alex and Emily, their faces pale and tense. "We need to get back," Alex said, his voice uncharacteristically stern. "This place doesn't feel right." Emily nodded reluctantly, packing up her gear. "Yeah, maybe we should call it a day," she agreed. As we made our way back to camp, that oppressive feeling just kept getting stronger. The prairie, once a symbol of freedom and tranquility, now felt like a vast, unending maze. Every rustle of grass, every distant sound, felt like a threat. That night, sleep was impossible. Again, the whispers continued, now accompanied by the sound of footsteps surrounding the tent. I sat wide-eyed, clutching my journal, as Alex and Emily slept fitfully beside me. Around midnight, a loud thud jolted me awake. I looked up to see Emily standing at the entrance of the tent, her eyes wide with fear. "Sarah, something's wrong," she whispered urgently. Before I could respond, a shadowy figure loomed at the edge of the tent, its form indistinct but undeniably human. My heart pounded as I tried to make sense of what I was seeing. "Alex," I called out, but the figure didn't respond. The presence felt malevolent, like this invisible force pressing against the fabric of the tent. I grabbed my flashlight, the beam cutting through the darkness, but the figure remained elusive, blending seamlessly with the shadows. "Stay calm," Alex whispered, waking up beside me. Together, we shone our lights around the tent, searching for any sign of intrusion, but the prairie was empty. The vastness of the grassland swallowed our efforts to find any answers. As dawn broke, the tension in the camp was so thick you could cut it with a knife. Emily was visibly shaken, her usual confidence replaced by this lingering fear. "We need to leave," she insisted. "Something's not right here." Alex nodded, packing up our gear quickly. "Agreed. We can't stay here another night." We loaded into the car, this sense of urgency driving us forward. The prairie stretched endlessly before us, and with each passing mile, the unease remained, like a shadow hanging over our retreat. As we drove, the GPS continued to malfunction, leading us further astray. Roads seemed unfamiliar, landmarks distorted by the vastness of the prairie. The sun began to set, and the sky turned this deep shade of crimson, casting an eerie glow over the landscape. "We need to find a way back to camp," I said, trying to stay focused despite the mounting fear. Alex glanced at me, his expression grim. "We're lost," he said. "The GPS is unreliable, and without proper signals, we can't navigate." Emily interjected, frustration evident in her voice. "This is exactly why we shouldn't have strayed so far. Now we're stuck out here in the dark." Then, the car's engine sputtered, a warning sign we couldn't ignore. Alex pulled over to the side of the road, the sky now a blanket of darkness studded with stars. "We need to figure this out manually," he said. "Let's use the maps and try to retrace our steps." As we stepped out into the cold night, the whispers returned, carried by the wind. "Leave now." They echoed once more, louder and more urgent. I felt a chill run down my spine, the oppressive presence of the prairie weighing heavily on us. We walked back towards where we thought the camp was, our flashlights the only things piercing the darkness. The prairie seemed endless, each step taking us further into the unknown. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, as if the very land was warning us to turn back. Suddenly, a loud crack echoed through the night. We froze, hearts pounding, as a shadowy figure darted across the prairie, disappearing into the darkness. "What was that?" Emily whispered, her voice trembling. Alex took a deep breath, trying to steady us. "We need to keep moving," he said. "Don't let fear stop us." But fear had already taken hold, the boundaries between reality and nightmare blurring in this vast, unforgiving landscape. As darkness settled over the prairie, we pushed on through the thickening night. The car had failed us, its engines sputtering ominously before giving up entirely. With only our flashlights to guide us, we trudged forward. The whispers of the prairie were growing louder, more insistent. "Stay close," Alex urged, his voice betraying a hint of panic. Emily followed, her usually steady steps faltering slightly. I kept my eyes forward, trying to ignore the shadows that seemed to dance just beyond the reach of our lights. After what felt like hours, we stumbled upon a narrow dirt path, flanked by tall grasses that swayed unnaturally in the breeze. Alex slowed, crouching to inspect the ground. "This might be an old ranger trail," he said. "It could lead us back to camp." We followed the path, the prairie gradually transforming around us. The grass became denser, the air heavier, as if the land itself was resisting our progress. The whispers now felt like voices, taunting and pleading all at once. Suddenly, Emily stopped, her flashlight illuminating a figure standing at the edge of the path. Her breath caught in her throat as she pointed. "Look." At first, I saw nothing, just more shadows. But then, the figure took a step forward, revealing a woman dressed in a flowing white dress, her face pale and eyes hollow. My heart pounded in my chest as Emily gasped, clutching my arm. "Is that the lady in white?" Emily whispered, recalling the stories we had laughed about around the campfire before. Before Alex could respond, the figure vanished, leaving us in stunned silence. The oppressive atmosphere pressed in, making each step forward more difficult. "We need to keep moving," Alex insisted, though his voice lacked conviction. "Dwelling on this won't help us." We pressed on, but the prairie seemed endless. Hours passed with no sign of our campsite or any familiar landmarks. Exhaustion set in, and frustration began to erode our already fragile group dynamic. As dawn approached, the first rays of sunlight struggled to penetrate the dense canopy of grasses. We were no closer to finding our way back, and the reality of our situation settled heavily upon us. We were lost, with dwindling supplies and no way to call for help. "We have to try to make it back before nightfall," Alex said, attempting to rally us. "We can retrace our steps." Emily nodded, though her usual enthusiasm was replaced by a grim determination. I clutched my journal, the weight of our predicament pressing down on me. The whispers had quieted, replaced by an eerie stillness that seemed to mock our efforts. As we continued, the prairie began to change. The grasses grew taller, the ground uneven and treacherous. It felt as though the land itself was shifting, leading us deeper into its embrace. The sense of being watched intensified, every rustle and snap of grass heightening our fear. Suddenly, Emily stumbled, falling hard onto the ground. Pain shot through her ankle, and she cried out, unable to put weight on it. Alex rushed to her side, his frustration giving way to concern. "We need to help her," I said, my voice steady despite the fear gnawing at me. Alex nodded, supporting Emily as best he could. "We can't leave her," he said, "but we also can't keep moving with her injured." As we debated our next move, the whispers returned, louder and more insistent. "Leave now," they seemed to chant, carried by the wind. Emily winced, clutching her ankle. "We can't stay here," she said. "It's not safe." Alex looked around, eyes darting nervously. "We need to find shelter," he said. "Maybe there's something up ahead." Reluctantly, we decided to press forward, using Emily's good leg and our support as a makeshift crutch. The prairie offered little in the way of natural shelters, but after what felt like an eternity, we came upon a small grove of trees, providing scant cover from the elements. We huddled together, the oppressive silence pressing in once more. The first night passed without incident, but tension remained high. Supplies were running low, and our morale was at its lowest. The next morning, we woke to find Emily missing. Panic surged through me as I scanned the grove, calling her name. Alex was frantic, searching the immediate area. "She was right here last night," he muttered, frustration and fear mingling in his voice. I ran in the direction I thought she might have gone, the whispers guiding me deeper into the prairie. The vastness of the land offered no clues, only endless stretches of grass that seemed to stretch into infinity. After what felt like hours, I stumbled upon the same abandoned cabin we had explored days before. My heart raced as I approached, calling out for Emily. The door was ajar, creaking eerily in the wind. Inside, the air was thick with decay. I called out again, my voice echoing off the walls. There was no response. Only the haunting whispers that seemed to emanate from the very walls themselves. Desperation fueled my search, moving from room to room. But Emily was nowhere to be found. Just as hope began to fade, a faint cry reached my ears from the attic. I climbed the rickety stairs, each step groaning under my weight. In the dim light, I found Emily bound to a makeshift altar, her eyes wide with terror. Before I could react, the shadows around us thickened, and the doppelgangers emerged from the darkness, Alex and Emily's twisted reflections, their eyes hollow and devoid of humanity. "Sarah," the doppelganger of Alex spoke, his voice a distorted echo. "You shouldn't have come here." I backed away, my mind racing. "What do you want?" The doppelganger smiled, a grotesque mimicry of our friend. "To take what you have," it said, "to replace you." Before I could respond, the doppelganger lunged, grabbing Emily and pulling her into the shadows. Alex's doppelganger followed, his grip like iron. I tried to fight back, but the forces were overwhelming. The last thing I saw was Emily's terrified expression before everything went black. I woke to find myself alone in the attic, Emily gone, and the doppelgangers nowhere in sight. Panic surged as I scrambled to free myself, the binds cutting into my skin. The whispers were louder now, more coherent. "Leave now," they commanded. Summoning every ounce of strength, I broke free and fled the cabin, stumbling into the open prairie. The sky was overcast, the sun hidden behind thick clouds that seemed to absorb the light. I called out for Alex, but his voice was absent. As I wandered, disoriented and desperate, the prairie seemed to close in around me. The whispers guided me, leading me deeper into the heart of the land. I couldn't shake the feeling that the doppelgangers were always one step behind, their presence a constant reminder of the nightmare I was trapped in. Hours passed, and fatigue set in. My ankle throbbed from the earlier ordeal, making each step a struggle. Just as I was about to succumb to exhaustion, I stumbled upon a stone circle, an ancient site, rumored in local legends to be the source of the prairie's dark energy. The air here was thick with malevolent energy. The whispers were now a cacophony of voices, urging me to turn back. But I knew this was my only chance. The legends spoke of rituals that could banish evil entities, and if I could perform one, perhaps I could save Emily and Alex and escape this nightmare. I took a deep breath, recalling the symbols we had seen etched into the cabin. Drawing from memory and intuition, I began to trace the symbols into the ground with my fingers, chanting the words I had memorized from the old campfire stories. The ground trembled beneath me, and the air crackled with energy. Shadows coalesced into the forms of the doppelgangers, their eyes burning with hatred. "You cannot defeat us," the doppelganger of Alex hissed, advancing towards me. With every ounce of will, I continued the ritual, the symbols glowing faintly under my touch. The storm that had been brewing overhead erupted, lightning illuminating the stone circle in blinding flashes. The doppelgangers recoiled, their forms flickering under the power of the ritual. Suddenly, a figure appeared amid the storm, a spectral version of myself, a true doppelganger formed from pure malevolence. It mirrored my every move, but its eyes held no mercy. "This ends now," I declared, focusing all my energy on the ritual. The clash was both physical and mental, a battle of wills against an entity that thrived on fear and doubt. The storm raged around us, the prairie a tempest of chaos and darkness. I felt the presence of Emily and Alex, their fates intertwined with mine, pushing me to fight harder. With a final surge of determination, I completed the ritual, the symbols blazing brightly before extinguishing in a burst of light. The doppelgangers screamed, their forms dissolving into the storm, leaving me alone in the now quiet stone circle. Exhausted and battered, I sank to the ground, the oppressive weight lifting. The storm had passed, and the first rays of sunlight pierced the clouds, bathing the prairie in a warm, golden light. In the distance, I heard a faint cry, Emily's voice calling out. Summoning my remaining strength, I followed the sound. Finding her and Alex lying unconscious near the cabin, the bindings removed as if by an unseen hand. I rushed to their side, relief flooding through me as I saw their familiar faces, albeit bruised and exhausted. They stirred, groggy but alive. "Sarah?" Alex mumbled, his voice weak. "What happened?" I helped them to their feet, supporting Emily's injured ankle. "We need to get out of here," I said. "No." We made our way back to the stone circle, the prairie seeming less hostile in the daylight. The whispers were gone, replaced by the soothing sounds of nature reclaiming the land. We moved swiftly, driven by the desire to leave the nightmare behind. As we reached the edge of the stone circle, the landscape began to change, the prairie giving way to a familiar trail that led us back to camp. The sense of direction returned, guiding us effortlessly towards safety. The walk back was filled with a heavy silence, each of us lost in our thoughts. The ordeal had left deep scars, both physical and emotional, but the presence of each other provided a semblance of hope. When we finally emerged from the prairie, the sight of our camp brought tears to my eyes. It stood as we had left it, the remnants of our struggles scattered, but untouched by the horrors we had faced. As dawn broke, we packed our belongings, the weight of our experience pressing down on us. The authorities were notified, though part of me doubted anyone would believe our story. The isolation of the prairie had been both our sanctuary and our prison, a place where reality and nightmare intertwined. In the days that followed, we were left to rebuild our lives. The memories of that terrifying week itched into our minds. Emily's ankle healed, but the emotional wounds remained, a constant reminder of the darkness that lurked within the heart of Maiduin National Tallgrass Prairie. Alex and I grew closer, our shared trauma forging a deeper bond. But the lingering fear of the doppelgangers and the possibility of their return haunted us, a shadow that loomed over our every step. One evening, as I sat writing about our experience, a sudden chill filled the room. I glanced out the window, half expecting to see the prairie's vastness staring back at me. Instead, I saw a reflection in the glass, another me, watching silently from the shadows. My blood ran cold as I realized the nightmare was not entirely over. The doppelgangers might have been banished from the prairie, but the darkness within me remained, a reminder that some horrors cannot be easily escaped.